From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $58 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 20th, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WCW Bash at the Beach recap. Brawl for All continues. Tons of news. By Observer staff. When you play the celebrity game, there is a risk. There's the risk the media and the public won't get interested and the deal becomes a money loser. And there's the risk that even if they do, trying to get outsiders, even if they are great athletes, to do a cram course in pro wrestling won't result in a good match. But there is the upside. While Hulk Hogan would have been one of the biggest stars in pro wrestling history without Cyndi Lauper and Mr. T, without question the rub-off of them helped catapult Hogan to a higher level of mainstream consciousness. Antonio Inoki would have been one of the biggest stars in pro wrestling history without Muhammad Ali, but if he wasn't a household name in Japan before their fight, he certainly has been for all of the past 22 years since their fight. And their fight was the ultimate in the risk not paying off and what the repercussions of that are, short-term disaster and stuff that long-term legends are created from. But as society has changed, so have the athletes. The biggest risk today isn't so much of a bad buy rate, or lack of media attention to sell it to the general public, or even of a bad match. The risk is, will the celebrity show up? And if he does, will he feel he's so high and mighty that what he's doing is a joke? Enter Dennis Rodman. Jake Roberts used to repeat the fable every time he turned heel. It went something like this. You see a wounded snake that's about to die. You save its life, you nurse it back to health and you treat it as a friend. It becomes your best friend. And one day out of nowhere, the snake bites you. You ask the snake, after all I did for you, why did you bite me? The snake responded, the first time you picked me up, you knew I was a snake. Rodman is Rodman. In another age, he'd be considered something entirely different. Sure, some of his actions are largely an exercise in self-promotion. And some, like blowing off practice in the middle of the playoffs, are something different. But he can get away with it. Because he can play. Actually, it is probably not a lot different from what would have happened in a previous generation except the media would have covered it up as in covering for him in those days rather than making a huge issue of it and thus making him more of a celebrity for it these days. But in this generation, doing things like that also make one a hero. He's cool. He does what he wants. So WCW invests a ton of money in him. And last year at the height of his celebrityhood, instead of using a football player or a boxer, athletes who have the rep of being tough, they tried a basketball player. He helped buy rates a little on 2 shows, although not nearly as much as revisionist history from people who know nothing about pro wrestling seem to think. He didn't help TV ratings one bit last year, nor one bit this year, and this year they needed it. But he was a success, because by being associated with WCW, it strengthened the WCW name probably to a level very close to equal the name brand of the WWF when it comes to pro wrestling. The fact his first match was something of a miracle as well and good for wrestling fans, but it wouldn't have mattered that much either way. Overall, in the giant scheme of things, it was a success and the fact the match quality was surprising had very little to do with it. But like the WWF found out earlier this year in dealing with Mike Tyson, or perhaps more importantly, the handlers of Tyson, when doing a television soap opera, it becomes quite unnerving when you never know until almost the last minute if one of the main characters is going to show up for his role. Tyson was supposed to make a lot more Raw appearances than he did, but in the end, the buy rate came in, and he was worth it. Even if the trust factor in what Tyson would do was so low, he ended up playing only a tiny role in the WrestleMania that realistically was built completely around him. But people bought the show and Steve Austin got the rub and he's a bigger star now than he would have been without it, even though he'd have been a huge star without it, just as Hogan got from Mr. T 13 years earlier. WCW had 1 match left on the Rodman contract signed in 1997. At one point, figuring they did all they could do with him last year, there was inside talk of WCW basically using the contract and giving the booking to New Japan for a dome show. While some in Japan thought the pub would be great, the idea of spending $750,000 for Rodman when they don't have pay-per-view, and on a show that is going to sell the same number of tickets with or without him didn't add up. So with one more date with Rodman, and with Karl Malone being a wrestling fan since childhood and the results of the NBA playoffs being very fortunate for WCW's plans, and more recently, a friend with Diamond Dallas Page, and with the natural rivalry from the NBA, the idea was born. Lots of reporters are now asking the question, since the truth was both Malone and Rodman knew the angle, and as it turned out, are both being represented by Dwight Manley, the same agent, that perhaps their little tumble in the playoffs was a spot arranged ahead of time. This has made a lot of reporters and probably some basketball fans uneasy if pro wrestling high spots to hype a pay-per-view intrude into their shoot sport. As well it should, because in reality there is a very thin line between work and shoot, and working is already intruding into other shoot sports. The media attention was huge, particularly in the days leading to the match, and it's that media attention that leads to pro wrestling expanding its mainstream consciousness and becoming regarded as something that's in for however brief a period the media stays interested, and gets people who aren't wrestling fans to be curious and order the show. The match was a disaster, probably due as much to Rodman as anything, although Hogan wanting to go out there with two green guys for that long a period didn't help matters. The fact the match was a disaster didn't appear to be lost on most of the reporters, although the blistering next day columns were likely to be negative simply because Malone, who they wanted to believe was a pure athlete, and not a goof like Rodman, has lowered himself into participating. Like Lawrence Taylor before him, and even Mike Tyson for that matter, somehow participating in pro wrestling is worse than drug problems or jail sentences, and altogether different from an athlete using his name to try to break into a business like acting or announcing where they haven't paid their dues and aren't actually qualified for. When the smoke cleared, and it probably still hasn't out of Rodman's eyes, it wasn't altogether different than most WCW pay-per-view events. Some good wrestling underneath, and matches that get progressively worse until climaxing with Hulk Hogan stumbling around in a poor match that usually draws a hell of a buy rate. This time there was a bigger miscalculation than usual. Hogan came in and insisted that his match be given 45 minutes, which under the best of circumstances, is more than enough time for even the best workers to get old, let alone a match with one good worker, one aging bad worker, and two non-workers. But they had a dry run match the previous day and everyone involved figured the match was going to surprise everyone. But the joke, this time, was on Hogan. Rodman showed up apparently in no condition, whether it was physically, or mentally, or both, to perform. He fell down when he wasn't supposed to and basically stumbled around and screwed up a few spots early with Diamond Dallas Page, where you could practically see Page swearing under his breath about waiting his entire life for his day in the sun to become a real-life celebrity, and all of a sudden it was a hailstorm all over him and no roof over his head. And then, off camera, as Hogan was having to carry a match that was going way too long, Rodman put his head down on the turnbuckle and it almost appeared he was going to take a nap. Sorry folks, but it was established what Rodman was before he ever showed up for work, and if he can stay out all night in the middle of the playoffs to where he can't get up for practice, he certainly isn't going to curtail any outside activities for a fake pro wrestling match. So, as Mike Tenay hinted at during the broadcast, we know the description of his behavior several days earlier at the Pearl Jam concert in Dallas. But we have no idea what he'd been doing the past week that didn't make the paper. Nor does it better, except that he was being paid $750,000 for a day of work that he ended up sleeping through. Even under the best of circumstances, allotting 45 minutes to a match with two non-wrestlers is a bad move. And made the show that much worse because time was cut back on many of the underneath matches, a few of which, most notably Chris Jericho vs. Rey Mysterio Jr., which was cut back at the last minute from 18 minutes to 6 minutes, which is why none of the trademark Mysterio Jr. big moves took place. Chavo Guerrero Jr. vs. Eddie Guerrero and Bret Hart vs. Booker T, which were way too short for what they were trying to accomplish, and Conan vs. Disco Inferno, and perhaps Stevie Ray vs. Chavo Jr., was transformed from being a wrestling match to a quick high spot. I was in the distinct minority on this show in that I thought the undercard was strong enough and entertaining enough to carry an admittedly terrible main event. The work rate underneath blew away a WWF show, and the quality of the wrestling underneath blew away an ECW show. The heat was disappointing up and down the show, which made a lot of the matches seem worse than they actually were. The booking, at least underneath, was not only logical, but very good, with the exception of a gag that didn't work in the Stevie Ray vs. Chavo Guerrero Jr. non-match, which was at least short, and the skits involving Disco and Alex doing the Conan imitation and the byplay with Chris Jericho and J.J. Dillon over bringing in Mysterio Jr. were both hilarious. Bash at the Beach on July 12th at the Cox Arena in San Diego drew a sellout 10,095 fans, 9,031 paying $314,842.50 plus another $100,275 in merchandise, as a live event. Of course, the gate set the all-time record for San Diego, although virtually every city is breaking its gate records this year with a more affluent group of consumers on average, and the companies having the ability to charge and easily get higher ticket prices than at any other time in the history of the business. There was media from around the globe, including USA Today, Sports Illustrated, New York Daily News, AP, UPI, Entertainment Tonight, ESPN, and tons of local media from Chicago and Salt Lake City, along with San Diego. We have very preliminary buy rate information at press time that would indicate approximately 525,000 buys or about a 1.5 buy rate, which would be a $6.76 million company gross. If you figure that most of the recent WWF and WCW shows are averaging in the 0.8 range, and there was no reason to think that without Rodman and Malone this show would be any different. The national publicity involving Rodman and Malone since the undercard was nothing to speak of meant an additional $2.9 million in revenue on the show. The combined price of Rodman and Malone was probably in the $1.25 million range. Forget the media reports of $1.5 million for Rodman and $900,000 for Malone, and even throwing in Hogan's additional percentage of being part of such a large pie and several $100,000 more spent in mainstream advertising on this show as compared to any other show in company history. From a buy rate and profit standpoint, the show was a huge success. Maybe not to the degree of WrestleMania or close to the level of the first Hogan Sting, but a tremendous financial success nonetheless. In comparison, the two shows that Rodman appeared on last year, the Uncensored show where he appeared but didn't wrestle, drew an estimated $2.61 million, and the Bash at the Beach where he did wrestle drew an estimated $2.79 million. So this show looks to have done better than both of the previous shows combined. Although again we have to point out these are very preliminary estimates and that the business is much hotter, particularly in the mainstream at this time, than it was even 1 year ago. In the dark match, Los Villanos 4-5, Thomas and Raimundo Mendoza Diaz beat Damien, Leonardo Carrera, and Ciclope in 7:51 when Villano 4 pinned Damien in the only dark match on the show. Said to be decent. 1. Raven Scott Levy pinned Perry Sotelo in 10:40. Both guys worked really hard, but the match fell apart with an overbooked and poorly timed finish. Saturn whipped Raven into the guardrail 3 times, with the third bumped really hard. Saturn missed a leg drop off the top rope. Raven set up a table but nothing materialized from that until the finish. Saturn missed a plancha and crashed to the floor. Raven gave him a Russian leg sweep into the guardrail. Saturn used a chair shot to the elbow and a springboard leg drop onto the chair on Raven's face for a near fall. Lodi and Riggs both did run in, but Saturn gave them a simultaneous double back suplex spot which looked great. Saturn then springboarded off a chair with a drop kick in the corner that caught ref Nick Patrick. Saturn gave Raven a sick-looking bulldog headlock on the ring steps. Saturn pulled out a second table, put it on the first table, and put Raven on top of the first table like he was the meat in a table sandwich. This spot took forever to set up. To make it worse, Saturn went to the top rope for the plancha, but Canyon showed up and pulled Raven out between the tables. The problem was Canyon pulled Raven out before Saturn jumped. So Saturn was on top and jumped through 2 tables for no reason, which looked stupid. Canyon then raised Raven's hand as if he turned, but then gave him what I guess we should call Flatliner 2, since the original Flatliner was a Samoan drop and this one is a reverse Russian leg sweep. Lodi then put Raven on top after throwing Saturn in the ring, but Saturn still kicked out. Raven gave him the drop toe hold on the chair spot, but Saturn kicked out again. Saturn used a super kick to a chair that hit Raven in the face, but Riggs made the save, since this was a no DQ match. Saturn then delivered the Death Valley driver to Riggs, but in turning around, was hit by Raven's DDT for the pin. 2 1/4 stars. 2. Juventud Guerrera Anibal Gonzalez pinned Billy Kidman Pete Gruner in 9:55. Excellent work by both men, with the only negative being that they seemed to be rushing through their spots toward the end given the limited time they were given, and also the crowd which lost interest toward the finish since neither is a push performer. Kidman went for a pescado early, but Guerrera missed and he ended up taking out Lodi. Guerrera then did a springboard plancha to the floor where he took both Kidman and Lodi out with clotheslines. Kidman delivered an incredible German suplex in the ring, and then delivered the Masami powerbomb into a hot shot, except dropping Guerrera on the guardrail. Guerrera backdropped Kidman on the outside and delivered a powerbomb off the apron to the floor. With both on the top rope, Kidman delivered a low blow and did what amounted to a front powerbomb off the top rope. They continued with great spots, garnering limited crowd reaction, including a springboard off the ropes into a Frankensteiner on Kidman, who was crouched on the ropes, a Northern Lights suplex by Guerrero gathering momentum as Kidman came off the ropes, and a Urinage suplex. After landing on his feet after an attempt at another German suplex, Guerrero used the Michinoku driver 2, or the Hoovy driver as they're calling it, for a near fall. Kidman then missed the shooting star press and Guerrero hit the Firebird 450 splash for the pin. Kidman was somewhat cleaned up in his appearance as the beginning of an attempt to break him away from the flock and turn him into something of a serious cruiserweight heel, since the guy is so talented. It was actually his first singles match ever on a pay-per-view, and he really pulled out all the stops, and the two easily had the best match of the card. 4 stars. 3. Stevie Ray Lane Huffman beat Chavo Guerrero Jr., Salvador Guerrero 3, in 135 via submission from a handshake. Chavo was spraying the crowd with a super soaker, which was pretty hilarious. The gimmick was that this match was taking place before the hair versus hair match, with the idea that Ray was going to soften Chavo up and make him easy pickings for Eddie. Chavo instead just ran away, offered his hand for the handshake, and immediately submitted to save himself for the match with Eddie. The gag didn't work, although it was probably better than having to watch these two try and do a match with their immense size and talent disparity. Mike Tenay called it a 4 to 5 inch height difference and 75 pounds in weight, but I'd bet it's no less than 10 inches in height and 100 pounds, as Chavo is only 5'6" or 5'7" and 175 to 180, and Stevie Ray looks to be 6'5" and 285. 4. Eddie Guerrero beat Chavo Jr. in their hair versus hair match in 11:54. This was a good match, but not at the level you'd expect from these two in a major stipulation match. It had its flashes of brilliance but never really got going to the level it should have reached and was too short considering the stips. The two had great crowd heat for whatever reason, in particular the crowd was into Eddie as a heel. A few minutes of shortcuts and comedy early. Eddie used moves like the Goria Special and Caballo Camel Clutch, which were invented by his father. At one point Chavo came off the top rope for a dive but rolled through on the miss, landing on his feet, and when Eddie rushed toward him turned it into a tilt-a-whirl backbreaker, or quebradora as it's known in Mexico. But just like in the Hoovy match, about 8 minutes in, the crowd started losing interest. Bobby Heenan in the commentary claimed he had never seen a hair versus hair match before in his lifetime. I guess he doesn't remember the Roddy Piper versus Adrian Adonis match at the Pontiac Silverdome, which is weird because of his amazing memory for things from another era. Chavo suplexed Eddie on the floor. Eddie came back with a superplex off the top. Chavo went for Eddie's frog splash, but Eddie got his knees up. Eddie then used Chavo's tornado DDT finisher, which Eddie actually brought to the US from Japan, at which point Heenan said Chavo was about to get a trip to Floyd's, in reference to the barber on the Andy Griffith Show from the early 60s. Instead of going for the pin, Eddie went for scissors, but the ref stopped him from using them. He then went to the top for the frog splash, but Chavo moved. Chavo then hit the tornado DDT and went for the scissors. As Chavo was arguing with the ref, Eddie caught him with an inside cradle for the pin. Eddie brought in the electric razor, but Chavo got it away from him and threatened Eddie with it, saying that they should both shave their heads and look alike. Eddie left thinking Chavo was nuts, and Chavo shaved his own head with the razor. The original plan changed on this one, as the first idea and the reason for Stevie Ray was to have Ray beat Chavo first and weaken him, so Eddie had a tainted easy win. 3¼ stars. 5. Conan Charles Ashenoff beat Disco Inferno Glenn Gilberti in 2:16. Actually, the best part of the match was before it ever took place, with Alex Wright and Disco mimicking Conan's mic work. Conan came out with Kevin Nash, dressed up like the only 40-year-old who is still in high school, and Lex Luger dressed like one of the only 40-year-olds who still wants to compete in a bodybuilding contest. It was basically short and sweet, with Luger racking right outside the ring, Nash giving a high kick and powerbomb to Disco in the ring, and Conan finishing Disco off with the Tequila Sunrise submission. 1/4 star. 6. The Giant Paul White pinned Kevin Green in 6:58. This wasn't a good match, however Green is an amazing worker for only his 5th pro match. It was better than a lot of experienced people who are considered good workers have done on pay-per-view with Giant. The lame remark of the match was in trying to build up Giant for Goldberg. Heenan talked about Giant having a big winning streak when all he's done at every house show and even on the previous pay-per-view is lose. Green's work was adequate, highlighted by a Misawa flying elbow pad off the top rope, which Giant sold big. As Green ran in for a tackle, Giant caught him in the throat and choke slammed him and got the pin. That was a first. A pro athlete with almost no wrestling experience actually losing to a major wrestling star on pay-per-view. 1¼ stars. 7. Rey Mysterio Jr., Oscar Gutierrez, pinned Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, in 6 minutes to win the WCW Cruiserweight title. The pre-match antics with Jericho and Joe Dillon were hilarious. Dillon basically said that since Jericho was there and it was a pay-per-view, that they had a local guy who wanted a title shot, and Jericho said that you've got some independent jabroni for me. Dillon said that he hadn't even wrestled in about 6 months. Jericho then said to bring the jobber on out. Then Mysterio Jr.'s music played. Actually, this scenario got a pretty big pop, partially because they announced Mysterio Jr. as being from San Diego and he got probably a better reaction than expected. The match was real good due to Jericho, But it didn't have enough time and Mysterio Jr. didn't do anything to dispel any question marks about his return. He was noticeably larger, which unfortunately in his case serves no purpose. No matter how big he gets, he's still going to be small. The only thing he can do is be great, because at his size being good isn't enough. A bigger guy can sacrifice some agility for size, but any agility Mysterio Jr. is sacrificing for any reason is a mistake. I worry that he's trying to wrestle by other people's standards when by those standards set for other people he could never be in the business in the first place. The only standards he can make it on are the ones he invented by being out of this world as a performer. Jericho mainly worked over Mysterio Jr.'s bad knee. As a storyline, they really didn't play up much the idea it was Jericho who injured him in the first place or played it up as a grudge match, I guess not to interfere with the higher priority Malenko grudge match storyline. The highlight was when they brawled near a stage set up to look like a beach and Mysterio Jr. leapt off the lifeguard stand with a Hurricane Rana into a sandbox, and he was lucky it was sand because he didn't get all the way over on the move. Jericho did a power slam while both were standing on the top rope. Jericho did some hard chair shots to the knee, but Mysterio Jr. came back with chair shots and a dropkick to the knee. At one point Jericho nearly got the Lion Tamer but Mysterio Jr. made the ropes. Dean Malenko then showed up. At this point Jericho went into the Lion Tamer again, but Mysterio Jr. reversed it into a cradle for the pin. Jericho then tried to run away with Malenko chasing him, but as he went through the curtain, Warren Anderson blocked the way, allowing Malenko to catch him and beat him up backstage. On television the next night the title was given back to Jericho with the claim that since a suspended wrestler Malenko was at the arena and may have in some form contributed to the win, that the result of the match becomes null and void. At least it makes logical sense, which is more than 95% of the WCW angles do, although if you really want to make sense, then any title change due to outside interference, like every one of them in every promotion in the US should also be null and void if you try and take that rule to its logical conclusion. 2 3/4 stars. 8. Booker T. Booker Huffman beat Bret Hart via DQ in a TV title match in 28. The work that they did was real good. One thing that sometimes goes unnoticed about Hart's work is his positioning in the ring, and that every move Booker T did looked perfect, even more so than usual because Hart was in the right place at the right time. The problem with this match is it was too short and the finish came out of nowhere. Hart took a high hip toss over the top to the floor. T used a sidewalk slam and folding press for a near fall. Hart clotheslined T to the floor and gave him a hot shot on the guard rail. Hart slammed his back on the post and gave him the elbow off the middle rope and a Russian leg sweep. They did mess up Booker T's unique sunset flip spot in the corner. T then did a great looking round kick and an even better axe kick and a flapjack leading to the breakdance spot. T hit his missile dropkick finisher but Hart got his foot on the ropes. Hart went outside and T went for a pescado but Hart swung a chair like a baseball bat and nailed him. After a few more chair shots, Hart was DQ'd. After the match Hart began doing one chair shot after another to T's bad knee, which was the angle to set up T's absence due to arthroscopic knee surgery for a torn meniscus and a second-degree tear of the medial collateral ligament, and he should be out of action for 4 to 6 weeks. After numerous chair shots, Hart used the figure 4 around the post until Stevie Ray showed up. Ray walked to the ring slowly and never touched Hart, and instead yelled at Booker T and told the doctor that he didn't need help, although Ray and the ref carried him out of there. Ray still acted like he didn't care. 2 3/4 stars. 9. Bill Goldberg retained the WCW title, pinning Curt Hennig in 350 with the jackhammer. Goldberg's crowd reaction was very good, but not close to what it has been everywhere else of late, showing that a good percentage of the live crowd was there to see Rodman and Malone, and didn't follow WCW storylines. Hennig looked huge, but he was still smaller than Goldberg. When they showed a big crowd shot while piping in the chant, you could again see that nobody was chanting the name. It was about what you'd expect. Hennig did a good job except he messed up the roll through into the knee bar spot, and his Larry Hennig-style lariat looked terrible as a setup for the fisherman's suplex, which Goldberg kicked out of, leading to the spear/jackhammer combination. 1 star. 10. Hogan, Terry Bollea, and Rodman beat Paige Falkenberg, and Karl Malone in 23:47. The size deal got hysterical here. Rodman claims to be 6'6". Hogan is a few inches shorter, but Michael Buffer called him 6'7", and then said Rodman was 6'8". Mike Tenay then talked about how Rodman led the NBA in rebounds even though he's only 6'6". They made no mention that Malone's sister had passed away a few days before the match, even though it garnered some media publicity, and there were at least questions in some forums on whether it would cause him to miss the match. From all accounts, that never was a consideration in reality. Rodman was in for the first 320 and literally did nothing before tagging out. First move of the match was Malone slamming Hogan at the 5 minutes mark. Page tagged in. When Rodman tagged in for the second time, while he got a pop, it was clearly nothing like last year when he'd tag in. Crowd at this point was dead except for chants for Goldberg and chants of Utah sucks, which was because the people live hated Malone. Rodman screwed up a bunch of spots and tagged out to Hogan. Malone got beat up for a while, including Hogan body slamming him and dropping some elbows on him. Rodman also delivered 2 real good elbow drops, which was about the only thing he did good the entire match. Hogan did a back suplex on Malone which looked bad but not awful. Page tagged in and gave Hogan a flying clothesline until Rodman cut him off with a knee to the back. Hogan gave him a nice clothesline into the corner and began whipping him with his weight belt. Hogan gave Page a stiff clothesline, but since Hogan was having to carry things since Rodman was of no help, he was gassing out badly by this point. Fans were booing when Rodman got in. Hogan missed perhaps the single most pathetic leg drop of his career on Malone, and even that got no pop by this point. Malone tagged in with a bad clothesline but got a pop for body slamming Rodman. He then went to execute a noggin knocker, but Hogan and Rodman's head didn't come within a foot of each other, setting a new all-time low standard for a basic comedy spot. Finally, Page hit the diamond cutter on Hogan, Malone hit the cutter on Rodman. However, Ed Leslie ran in and gave the Stone Cold Stunner to Page, which actually got a big babyface pop for the pin. After the match, Malone gave a diamond cutter to Leslie and to ref Charles Robinson. The best thing I can say about Malone is he was better than a lot of beginners I've seen in their first match who have had more training, but I've seen beginners a lot better as well, and for his age, and hell, for any age, he has a hell of a physique. As for Rodman, I think it's wonderful that wrestling is such a great business that a guy can score that much money and stink the joint out and still have people begging for him to do it again because he gets media attention, which in turn sells tickets. And when it comes to wrestling, as good or as bad as it gets, that's the real bottom line, because economics says so. -1.25 star. Other notes, although it was never announced on television, at one point there were plans for a Sting and Lex Luger title defense, don't get me started, against Scott Hall and Disciple, but they were dropped a few days before the show, and its in place was the Conan vs. Disco Inferno match just to give the NWO Wolfpack a brief appearance on the show. Hall and Scott Steiner, among others, were also there and made a brief cameo, leaving with Hogan and Rodman after the main event. Hogan had booked out 45 minutes for the main event, which, with intros and everything else, wound up ending about 12 minutes early, so they had the announcers kill time as talking heads for a few minutes and wound up going off the air about 7 minutes early. An article in the Miami Herald claimed before the match that the finish of the main event would be Malone pinning Rodman after a diamond cutter. Chris Kanyon and Billy Kidman were among those working with Page in training Karl Malone. Both Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan had people representing them asking for tickets to the event as they were playing in a golf tournament not far from San Diego. However, both didn't show up. WCW had kept it quiet that they were coming, and even if they were there, it was never to be acknowledged on television, as I guess they didn't want the pub. The major celebrities there were NBA stars Antoine Carr, who was shown many times, and Tracy Murray, and NHL star Chris Chelios. By giving away the first Hulk Hogan vs. Bill Goldberg match on July 6th, which became the most watched wrestling match in cable television history, WCW Nitro broke the 5-week winning streak of Raw, but it only lasted for 1 week, as even though Raw was back on top on July 13th, despite being just 1 day after all the mainstream publicity WCW received through using Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman on pay-per-view. The fact that Malone and Rodman meant absolutely nothing for television ratings but still drew a buy rate shows once again that drawing money at the gate, drawing money on pay-per-view, selling merchandise, and drawing television ratings are 4 different animals. As a general rule, both sides are pretty close when it comes to house show business. WWF averages more fans per show, but WCW draws more sellouts and comes closer to capacity at its shows. WCW has the edge on pay-per-view. Merchandise is a hard one to figure out, but it appears WWF has a slight lead due to Steve Austin. And while WWF is now clearly ahead when it comes to ratings on Monday night, WCW remains overall the ratings leader. By far too many in the industry putting too much emphasis on Monday night ratings, it ignores that no matter who wins on Monday, and WWF is and should win most weeks because it puts on a better Monday night television product more of the time. Both sides are doing huge business, and from an overall standpoint, neither side can make any kind of a valid claim to be ahead overall. The Hogan vs. Goldberg title change was the first quarter hour in the history of pro wrestling on cable to reach 5 million homes, drawing 5,054,000 homes, in excess of 7 million total viewers, or a 6.91 rating and 11.8 share, breaking the all-time record of 4,774,000 homes. 6.53 rating and 10.7 share, set by the match where Hogan won the title from Randy Savage after a one-day reign on April 20th. The combined audience of both shows in the final quarter hour hit another all-time peak with 7,873,000 homes, or a combined 10.75 rating and 18.3 share, with WWF billing a triangle match for the #1 contendership with Undertaker, Kane and Mankind, which didn't quite take place as its television main event, which did a 3.84 rating and 6.5 share, although the overall combined head-to-head audience over 2 hours record remains with the night of April 20th. In the post-1988 era, Hogan-Goldberg was not the highest-rated wrestling match ever on cable, but it passed the August 28, 1994 Hogan vs. Ric Flair Clash of Champions match, 6.7, for third place on the list, behind the Royal Rumble match on January 24, 1988, which did an 8.4 rating, and the March 27, 1988 Clash of Champions match where Ric Flair and Sting went to a 45-minute draw, which did a 7.1 rating for the entire 45 minutes, peaking with a 7.8 for the final quarter hour. A figure even more impressive since it was going head-to-head with WrestleMania on pay-per-view. For the night, WCW captured 7 of the 8 head-to-head quarters to earn a 4.93 rating, 4.52 first hour, 4.43 seconds hour, 5.59 third hour, and 8.07 share to Raw's 4.00 rating, 3.64 first hour, 4.37 seconds hour, and 6.52 share. The Raw peak rating was a 4.8 for the Val Venis vs. Dustin Runnels match, and more likely for the DX spoof on The Nation, which still lost to the 5.3 for a Wolfpack in the House Party. Besides the Hogan-Goldberg match, which saw the WCW increase by nearly 1.2 million homes over 15 minutes, or an incredible 30%, WCW's second-best quarter was a 5.4 for the end of the Marcus Bagwell interview and the first few minutes of the Goldberg vs. Scott Hall match, which actually fell to a 5.0 for the finish. Nitro Replay did a 1.45 rating and a pretty spectacular 8.35 share. Nitro figured to have the edge this week, coming off the momentum from the Goldberg title win and the curiosity of the pay-per-view the previous day, but the live Raw from the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey scored a 4.65 rating, 4.44 first hour, 4.86 seconds hour, and a 7.7 share to Nitro's 4.46 rating, 4.68 first hour, 3.95 seconds hour, 4.74 third hour, and 7.6 share. Nitro Replay did a 1.3 rating and 7.5 share. Raw grabbed the lead in the first quarter with a 4.3 rating for the return of Shawn Michaels in the Undertaker vs. Vader match, to Nitro's 3.8 for Hulk Hogan pushing Marcus Bagwell out of his wheelchair, and the Bret Hart vs. Fit Finlay match. Raw captured the next 5 quarters, with its biggest win coming at the top of the second hour with a 5.43 rating for the Mankind and Kane victory of the tag titles over New Age Outlaws, while WCW was down to a 3.79 rating for the Dean Malenko vs. Rey Mysterio Jr. match for the #1 contendership for the Cruiserweight title. Raw dropped from that point in the second hour while Nitro picked up in every quarter. Raw still won the second quarter in the final hour by a 4.84. Taka and Too Much vs. Kaientai and beginning of McMahon interview to set up the tag title rematch, to 4.49, Wright and Disco vs. Luger and Nash and Eddie Guerrero vs. Steve McMichael before Nitro won its only 2 quarters of the night, a 5.25, beginning of Hogan vs. Scott Hall with Bischoff as referee, to 4.44, end of McMahon interview with DX, Austin and Undertaker to set up tag title, beginning of Severn vs. Kama, and 5.41, end of Hogan vs. Hall plus Goldberg vs. Hennig, to 4.54, end of Severn vs. Kama and tag title rematch. The WWF officially and quietly cancelled its August 8 football show scheduled for Foxborough Stadium due to a poor advance. It was the first bad sign during the year where business has been booming. As mentioned last week, only a little more than 2,000 tickets had been sold for the show in the large stadium after a few days of sales, a number considerably less than was expected. The hope for pickup in sales after the July 10th event at the Fleet Center didn't materialize, and to cut its losses, the decision was made on July 13th to cancel the show. Since wrestling has been so hot, almost anything not being successful from a dollar standpoint becomes a surprise. After 3 weeks, the jury is still out on the WWF's Brawl for All concept, legitimate contests involving boxing with oversized 20-ounce gloves and wrestling takedowns. There has been a lot of curiosity and favorable reaction from some parts, and for the most part the ratings for the segments had been good, but after a decent crowd reaction the second week, there could be no denying the negative crowd reaction at the Continental Arena on the July 13th Raw show, nor the fact that airing the matches exposes too many of the guys as neither being able to wrestle or box, and this past week it badly exposed Jerry Lawler and Shawn Michaels as to just how little they actually knew about wrestling. In a surprise, probably because of the feeling the concept wasn't working and to build some interest in it, and because the fans who were interested in it were more interested in seeing Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock involved, the WWF asked both Severn and Shamrock to participate just before the television tapings on July 13th. Severn accepted literally with no notice while Shamrock declined. So the story going around that Shamrock was supposed to wrestle 8-Ball may very well have been the plan in someone's mind, but it was agreed to. In the third week of the 4-week first round, Bart Gunn beat tag team partner Bob Holly in a match that appeared suspicious at times, and clearly ended with a worked angle. In the other match, Severn beat Kama Mustafa, now known strictly as the Godfather, in probably as poorly announced and explained a match as WWF has had in a long time. In the matches on July 14th, Too Cold Scorpio beat 8-Ball and Steve Williams destroyed Pierre, setting up semifinal pairings of Steve Blackman vs. Bradshaw, Savio Vega with an apparent bye, Severn vs. Bart Gunn, and Williams vs. Scorpio, which appears to lead to semifinals of Blackman vs. Vega and Williams vs. Severn, which would be a rematch of the match in the 1981 NCAA wrestling tournament where Williams pinned Severn. Gunn vs. Holly, who basically used the match as a catalyst to apparently break up the failed attempt to recreate the Midnight Express tag team, although they were back together as a team the next night, drew a 4.3 rating, beating the 4.0 that WCW drew with Rick Martel vs. Stevie Ray. Severn vs. Kama did a 4.4 in the first round and a 4.5 for the final 2 rounds, but lost going to head-to with WCW's Hogan vs. Hall match. On July 6th, the Vega vs. Brackus match did a 4.1 rating and was the only match to win its time slot against Nitro, although a large part of that rating came because Raw traditionally opened strong, and it followed an interview with McMahon, Austin, and Undertaker. The second Brawl match with Hawk vs. Darren Drozdov did a 4.2 rating, which was a huge pickup from the 3.4 the previous quarter, although again it was likely bolstered by a McMahon interview with Mankind, Kane, and Undertaker that preceded it. It's still unlikely that if Vega vs. Brackus or Hawk vs. Drozdov were out there doing wrestling matches instead of whatever it is they were doing, that the ratings would have done as well. Severn replaced Sean Stasiak in the match against Kama. It's just as obvious that Severn wasn't clear what this was and what he was doing, because every time he took Kama down, he tried to pin him and at the end even was trying to submit him, even though the rules call for stand-ups after every takedown, which are rules that only emphasize Severn's weaknesses when it comes to being a colorful fighter. This match was bad enough that it could be labeled a fiasco in every sense, both because Severn apparently didn't understand the concept and even more so, because of the nonsensical scoring and horrid commentary which made it appear to viewers that Severn was losing, and then he was announced as a winner for no reason. Severn scored 2 takedowns in the first minute, and not only that, turned him and had him pinned both times, although there was nothing in the rules that said Kama had to defend against being pinned once taken down. At this point the unofficial scoreboard had Severn up 5-0, and the announcers, in particular Lawler and Michaels but even Ross, weren't sure if the second takedown was a takedown despite the fact Severn actually had Kama pinned, and anyone who has ever wrestled in their lives knows that inherently either a takedown or a reversal, which doesn't exist under these rules, has to take place before someone has his back to the ground for near fall points. Severn scored 2 more takedown in the second round, which should have given him 20 points, but Lawler and Michaels didn't think they were takedowns because they were just takedowns as opposed to spectacular throws, but the scoreboard listed it as Kama being up 10-5, which made no sense at that point. In the third round, Severn scored another takedown that the announcers didn't recognize as a takedown, and thus it confused everyone and made it appear Severn was given a gift when he was announced the winner, when in actuality it was pretty one-sided, like realistically the score should have been 25-5. Severn, who has never been much of a striker, was never even tagged standing up, and realistically from a standing position the round should have been even as nobody got any real advantage. Kama was visibly upset after the match, perhaps because Severn was trying submissions and not letting him up after taking him down, which were against the rules, and Kama legitimately refused to shake his hands after the match. Beyond that, and perhaps more importantly, the crowd hated the match, chanting "We want wrestling," and it was clear that Severn's takedowns wasn't what they perceived either pro wrestling or fighting to be about. To Kama's credit, he seemed to have some ability to momentarily block the takedowns before losing his position, and probably would have beaten most of the men in the tournament up to this point. The Gunn vs. Holly match started with the announcement that Jim Cornette had resigned as manager of the team in protest of this fight. In reality, Cornette had decided to quit as a manager legitimately. Based on the camera work with Holly's facials, at least some of this match was a work. Gunn had a slight edge in the first round, which the crowd heavily booed. Gunn easily won the second round, which the fans booed even more, and stunned Holly both in the second and third round but never knocked him down en route to what should have been a 15-0 victory. Unlike in the two previous weeks' matches, none of the four appeared to blow up. After the match, Holly attacked Gunn, breaking up their tag team, and they had a pull-apart brawl, which quite frankly looked as believable as their match itself, as in particular it appeared both men were really taking something off their punches in the first round. It could be that both simply don't know how to punch, but it appeared an effort to not put power in the punches that at least looked suspicious, combined with the facials throughout making it clear from the start Holly was going to lose, and then jump him after the match. Other wrestlers that have been involved in this have categorized it to a point as a shoot, but when friends have fought they are going out of their way not to hurt each other with punches, although with those big gloves it wouldn't be easy. Where all this becomes interesting is that these matches were held in New Jersey, where the WWF has argued for years that it shouldn't be regulated because it's predetermined entertainment, an argument that up until this night was valid at least to the point that predetermined entertainment was not sport. But whatever these matches should be categorized as, predetermined nor entertainment probably aren't words that are applicable. Figuring Severn should be able to take Gunn down. Whether they can get Lawler and Michaels to watch one actual wrestling match between now and then to recognize what a takedown actually looks like is another story, and Gunn appeared to have less experience standing than makes Severn a favorite to reach the semifinals, where if all goes according to expected plan, he'd face Williams in what would become an intriguing matchup because Williams should have a good chance to avoid being taken down and would probably be the better striker of the two, if the idea lasts that many more weeks. We are in the process of completing what I hope to be considered the best booklet ever written on pro wrestling, which will be a collection of obituary articles from the past 10 years out of this newsletter. The booklet, which will be approximately 170 pages, will feature lengthy articles on the lives of Bruiser Brody, Paul Bosch, Buddy Rogers, Andre the Giant, Steve Schumann, Kerry Von Erich, Dino Bravo, Oro, Boris Malenko, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, John Studd, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Fritz Von Erich, Dr. Jerry Graham, Brian Pillman, Louis Spicolli, and Junkyard Dog. These will all be reprints of articles that have already appeared in The Observer, but this is a chance for newer readers to have a complete collection of some of the best articles ever from this publication and for longtime readers to have them all in one bound volume. Put together, this booklet literally speaks volumes about the pro wrestling industry. The booklet, produced in conjunction with the Powerbomb website, will be completed at the end of August, but advance orders are now being taken. The booklet, called Tributes, is available for $20 plus $3 for postage and handling within North America, or $5 for surface mail in the rest of the world, or $12 for airmail in the rest of the world. For more information, or to send checks or money orders payable to Powerbomb website, you can write to Powerbomb website, P.O. Box 1523, Carborough, North Carolina 27510. For more information on the booklet, you can check out the website httr://www.powerbomb.com/tributes or email to tributes@powerbomb.com. We have also made some minor changes in the Wrestling Observer hotline. Basically, I will be on the hotline on option 1 7 days a week. Bruce Mitchell, abiding wrestling with many years experience, will be on option 2 7 days a week. Option 3 will be Steve Beverly, Tuesday through Saturday, and Georgianne Macropolis of Wrestling Chatterbox, Sunday and Monday. Brian Alvarez, who does Figure 4 weekly, will be on option 4 7 days a week, and option 5 will consist of Mike Mooneyham of the Charleston Post-Courier, Monday through Wednesday, and the soon-to-be-married Stephen Prozik, who has done wrestling announcing for several promotions in the Georgia and Texas area, often as the sidekick for WCW Saturday night announcer Scott Hudson, Thursday through Sunday. There will be 2 new messages put on daily, except on Tuesdays, which will have 3 new messages, and pay-per-view nights, which will have 2 additional messages to complement the regular 2 messages on Sunday. The schedule for new messages is Monday, Meltzer/Mooneyham, Tuesday, Mitchell/Beverly/Alvarez, Wednesday, Meltzer/Alvarez, Thursday, Mitchell/Prozik, Friday, Meltzer/Beverly, Saturday, Mitchell/Beverly, Sunday, Alvarez/Macropolis. In addition, if there is a major story, I will be updating option 1 for it, and other options may be updated more frequently if there are breaking major stories. Lance Russell on the main menu will have details of when or if there is a special update. On Tuesdays, option 2 features coverage of Raw, and option 4 will feature coverage of Nitro. Generally, on the weeks of a Tuesday night Raw taping, we will have a rundown of the next week's Raw on Wednesday on option 4. The cost of the hotline will remain 99 cents per minute, and the number remains 900-903-9030 with children under 18 needing parents' permission before calling. Options 7 and 8 are reserved for rundowns of all pay-per-view shows. I'm on option 7 approximately 20 minutes after the conclusion of the show, and we immediately run down the major angles and results before getting into the details of the show. Option 8 reports are up later that evening to get another perspective. The reports stay up on the hotline until the next pay-per-view show. Upcoming pay-per-view shows that will be covered will be July 26th WWF Fully Loaded, August 2nd ECW Heatwave, August 7th K1. The reports on options 7 and 8 will only be up for one day, August 8th New Japan Osaka Dome. I will have a report on the show on option 1 which will be available by 2 p.m. Eastern Time on August 8th. August 8th WCW Road Wild, August 30th WWF SummerSlam, September 13th WCW Fall Brawl, and September 27th WWF In Your House. For those in the Phoenix area, I'm on between 10 and 11 a.m. every Wednesday on Cadus, 1060 a.m. running down the latest wrestling news. Japanese Television Rundown. June 24th KRS Pride 3, as a pay-per-view show. This makes 3 in a row for KRS when it comes to thumbs down shows. The problem with KRS when it comes to Vale Tudo as compared to Semaphore Entertainment Group, which has produced generally good, often great shows, seem to lie with the two basic differences: the octagon versus a boxing/wrestling ring, and the lack of a stand-up rule when the matches slow down with long guard sequences. For all the purists who argue about artificial stand-ups, time limits and judges' decisions ruining UFC, they should be sentenced to having to actually watch some of the matches from the previous KRS show, in particular the Henzo Gracie 50-minute match, and it should be a jolt back to reality. And speaking of that, 1. Shunsuke Matsui and Akira Shoji went to a 40 minutes draw. In a sense, this was an amazing match as far as both men's physical condition, because it wasn't a stallfest in the least. It was mainly straight mat wrestling, which is tiring enough going 5 minutes, let alone going 40 minutes, and neither men gassed out. Shoji would have easily won the decision as he dominated most of the way, but it wasn't totally one-sided, and Matsui deserves a lot of credit for his stamina and ability to survive and get out of some bad predicaments. Shoji got Matsui's back several times and it appeared was going to be able to choke him, but whenever Shoji went for a submission, Matsui, who started out as a pro wrestler under Takada, was able to pull an escape or reversal. Matsui did rock Shoji with a punch in the second round, but in follow-up. Because of that, I'd rate the second round even, since Shoji dominated the ground in that round as well, but Shoji clearly won the other 3 rounds. In the third round, Shoji got a good flurry of blows in, and later got his back again, but Matsui survived. In the fourth and final round, Shoji again tagged Matsui with a lot of punches, which ended up bloodying Matsui's nose, but again when he went for a choke, Matsui got away. Even so, the fans booed the match when the bell rang because it wasn't very entertaining, even though both deserve a lot of praise for hanging in there so long and not mentally quitting. 2. Dayu Takase beat Emmanuel Yarbrough in 13:22. Yarbrough trimmed down to a svelte 682 pounds for this fight. This was held in a very big ring which Takase used to his advantage, as Yarbrough couldn't cut the ring off, which was the difference between this match and his previous match in Japan against Tatsuo Nakano. Takase basically ran away and Yarbrough tried to catch him, and he was basically blown up 2 minutes into the match. There were a few exchanges of punches, but nothing did serious damage. Takase continued to run away to try and wear Yarbrough out. The first round was amazing because Takase basically never touched him and he was killing him by attrition because Yarbrough was carrying so much weight. Almost like the old boxing tales of Willie Pep being able to win a round without even throwing one punch. In the second round, Yarbrough nearly caught Takase twice and the fans began chanting for Yarbrough even though his opponent was Japanese. Even though nothing was happening, this match was both perversely entertaining as a spectacle and entertaining from a strategy standpoint as well. Takase kept running away until the ref gave him a yellow card and threatened disqualification. Takase then went for a tackle and Yarbrough fell on him, but luckily Takase was able to move enough so that Yarbrough fell on his leg rather than his chest, which would have been a killer. With Yarbrough on the ground, Takase began throwing punches to the face and the knee, and he even tried an armbar. Takase kept pounding and eventually was able to slip his leg out and kept throwing punches, bloodying Yarbrough's nose, and then he tapped out. Before the next match, Boss Rutan did an interview in both English and Japanese. He said that he would be facing Randy Couture for the UFC championship, and after he wins the title and fulfills his UFC contract, he wants to fight with his promotion and challenged Rickson Gracie. Fat chance of that match ever happening. 3. Kazushi Sakuraba beat Carlos Newton in 15:19. This was the best match on the show, but it was in structure closer to a high-level pancrase match than a UFC match. What was amazing to watch is that as fast as Newton moves on the ground, Sakuraba was noticeably quicker. The result was an upset to most martial arts insiders because of Sakuraba's background as a pro wrestler and participating in works going against a proven top-level shooter. In the first round, Sakuraba nearly got an armbar in the first minute but couldn't quite complete it, and later nearly got an ankle. Sakuraba controlled the match on the ground, but kept going for submissions and didn't throw a punch on the ground until the 9 minutes mark, and he had plenty of opening to punch and appeared to choose not to. Newton's big chance was early in the second round where he got Sakuraba's back and began throwing knees and punches, but Sakuraba reversed. He went for another armbar, but Newton used that to reverse him, but in the scramble Sakuraba eventually got the ankle and turned it into a knee bar, forcing Newton to tap in a somewhat similar finish as the Shamrock Horn UFC match. This was a great technical match, but it wasn't as exciting because it was so technical as the better UFC matches this year. 4. Gary Goodridge beat Amir in 7:23. Amir was a Joe Moreira student from Los Angeles who was subbing for the injured Chemo. Goodridge is much smaller than in his UFC days. After a good opening exchange, Amir tried to throw but Goodridge blocked it and landed on top. Goodridge landed some hard punches, but Amir also came close to finishing it with an ankle lock, but he didn't appear to have the technique down enough to finish him. Goodridge ended up slipping out of an attempted triangle and began throwing punches from the mount, and the third punch in a sequence knocked Amir silly, and the ref wisely stopped the match. 5. Mark Kerr beat Pedro Otavio in 2:13. Kerr was also much smaller and also a lot less muscularly defined than in his UFC days where he literally looked like a cartoon character. The difference was so pronounced you'd think the guy went from being a steroid freak to going clean. I mean, you'd think it if you see the before and after shots. Kerr took Otavio down and simply overpowered him, getting a hammerlock after some body shots. Otavio was screaming in pain and the ref stopped the match. Otavio then threw a temper tantrum in the ring because he had never tapped, although if the ref hadn't have stopped it, Kerr may have separated his arm from his shoulder. Otavio started throwing his knee pads into the crowd as a sign of protest when the ref explained to him the hold was too dangerous and he had no choice but to stop the fight. 6. Nobuhiko Takada beat Kyle Sturgeon in 2:17. It was clear from the crowd reaction that everyone was there to see Takada, although the crowd size, 4,500 at Budokan, showed that the number of people he draws nowadays is way down from his glory years. Takada didn't look at all concerned going into the ring, which spelled work in capital letters even before the match started. Anyway, it was a believable looking work but an obvious work. Takada went down on a knockdown from a kick before coming back with a heel hook for the submission. Since it was a work and they exchanged hard kicks, the crowd was pretty excited as it was going on, probably more than any other match on the show. June 28, All Japan. 1. Giant Baba and Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota beat Haruka Eigen and Masa Fuchi and Jun Izumida in 9:25. About 4 minutes aired on television, and that was about 4 minutes too much. It's a comedy match with very little remotely entertaining. Actually, aside from Eigen spitting in Kimura's face and the way Kimura sold it as if he was really grossed out, nothing was funny. Kimura ended up pinning Fuji after a combination of a foot to the face by Baba and a weak lariat by Kimura too. Steve Williams and Wolf Hockfield beat Masao Inoue and Takao Mori in 14:17. The last 10 minutes aired. This was Williams' final match in Japan before leaving for WWF. He worked almost the entire way and really didn't look like much. Hockfield finally tagged in just before the finish and the people weren't buying his stuff even though he didn't look bad. When Williams tagged in for the finish, he and Inoue really turned it on with a lot of good near falls and reversals. Inoue racked Williams at one point. Inoue kicked out of the Oklahoma Stampede and reversed a backdrop driver. Williams also used a Dr. Bomb, but Inoue came back with a quick power slam until finally Williams delivered the backdrop driver. Williams got a pretty good ovation leaving, but it wasn't overwhelming or what you'd expect considering he's been a regular with this group for 8 years as a top star. 2 stars. All Japan. The toll of the modern hard-hitting style is continuing to take this company, just 2 months from drawing 58,300 fans at the Tokyo Dome, almost down to a minor league level due to lack of angles and storylines. Kenta Kobashi is now working with both knees that require surgery, but with Mitsuharu Misawa out of action until late August, he can't take any time off. This tour is only doing slightly better than the previous one, which was the worst drawing tour in the history of the company. After this tour ends on July 24th with the Budokan show headlined by Kobashi vs. Jun Akiyama for the Triple Crown, they'll be off until August 22nd with a tour going through September 9th. The traditional Budokan show at the end of the tour isn't going to take place in early September, as the tour will only include a few mid-sized cities, with the major show on September 6th in Kyoto. For a company that revolves around tradition, canceling the regular early September Budokan is one bad sign, and the situation with Stan Hansen not getting booked regularly is another bad sign. Giant Baba became the first wrestler in Japanese history ever to wrestle in 5,700 matches on July 7th in Gamagori. Considering Baba's career is just under 38 years and he'd been a full-time regular from day one and missed very few shows due to injuries, he's actually something of the Cal Ripken Jr. of wrestling, as I recall around 1984 when he missed a show due to an injury. It was the end of something like a 2,000 consecutive game streak, which if you think about it is a lot more amazing for a pro wrestler than for a baseball player. When you hear about wrestlers who talk about having wrestled 6,000 matches in their career or 5,000 matches, you know those figures are heavily exaggerated, because with the possible exception of Luthez, I doubt there is anyone who actually has wrestled more matches than Baba. They've been running a tournament this entire week to crown a new PWF Junior Heavyweight Champion since Manukia Mossman vacated the title on June 12, since it was ridiculous, as he'd grown way too large to be a junior heavyweight. On July 6th in Hamamatsu, Tsuyoshi Kikuchi pinned Yoshinobu Kanemaru. July 7th in Gamagori saw Kikuchi pin Kentaro Shiga and Yoshinari Ogawa beat Kanemaru. July 9th in Kochi had Satoru Asako pinning Kanemaru and Ogawa pinned Shiga. July 11th in Imabari saw Asako beat Kikuchi, and July 12th in Higashi Hiroshima saw Asako beat Shiga. So at press time Asako is 3-0, Ogawa is 2-0, Kikuchi is 2-1, Kanemaru and Shiga are both 0-3. The top 2 point getters meet for the title on July 19th in Niigata, New Japan. The Japanese-died elections on July 12 turned out to be the biggest story generally in the world, because Prime Minister Hashimoto, no relation, resigned due to his party faring far worse than expected. Of the 3 people with loose ties to pro wrestling, none of them fared well in their elections. New Japan wrestler Takashi Kengo Kimura finished 23rd for an at-large seat. Top 10 finishers make it. All Japan woman wrestler Yumiko Hata, running as part of the Hiwataro Party, the sports peace party that Antonio Inoki created in 1989, which Inoki quit earlier this year, got, as expected, very little support, nor did Inoki's older brother. The only people in the Japanese Diet, which is equivalent to the Senate, with any relations to pro wrestling are All Japan wrestler Hiroshi Hase and the wife of Kimura. Kimura, who was bicycling around Japan every day campaigning, has dropped about 15 pounds but will now be coming back to pro wrestling with his first match back on July 31st at Sumo Hall. This company appears to be working an angle with K1 involving Naoya Ogawa. It was announced that added to the July 18th K1 show at the Nagoya Dome will be a UFO rules match with Ogawa vs Yoji Anjo, which, considering it will air on a K1 show live in primetime on the Fuji network, means the match will have tremendous national exposure. UFO rules are 30-minute time limit, wearing grappling gloves, and one would assume doing worked versions of shoot matches similar to Ogawa's recent matches with the likes on Don Fry, where pins don't count and finishes are either via 3 knockdown rule, via knockout, or via submission. K1 has also added 2 more house shows for this year, on August 28th and October 28th, both in Tokyo at Yoyogi Gym, with Ogawa doing UFO rules matches on both shows. Apparently this whole deal is another attempt to make it appear that UFO is a different organization from New Japan when they start the promotion versus promotion feud later this year and can present Ogawa as a shooter from the outside rather than a New Japan pro wrestler, and with being given wins on high-profile K1 shows, Ogawa can be repackaged as a Japanese super shooter, which would enable him to get over even though he's kind of uncharismatic and is only a so-so worker at best. Both as a way to keep his name alive through Ogawa as his protege and for a feud with New Japan. Inoki will be in Ogawa's corner during his K1 matches. The big show of the week was July 14th in Sapporo before 5,500 fans at Nakajima Sports Center. The failure to sell out this show has to be considered another bad sign, headlined by Tatsumi Fujinami retaining the IWGP heavyweight title, beating Hiroyoshi Tenzan in 1607 with the old Inoki octopus submission. This sets up Fujinami defending the title against Masahiro Chono at the Osaka Dome on August 8th. Chono and Tenzan had a tag title defense scheduled against Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka on July 15th, in the same building. In the martial arts rules match, Fry and Brian Johnston beat New Japan wrestlers Kazuo Yamazaki and Kazuyuki Fujita in 10:26 when Fry knocked out Fujita. There is talk that the August 8th Tenryu vs Shinya Hashimoto match will be for Tenryu's Rikitozen Japanese heavyweight title. Tenzan was pulled from shows from July 11th to July 13th to rest up for his title shot. Due to his injury, Chris Benoit didn't appear on this Japanese tour, although Bryan Adams arrived on July 4th and has been working tag matches as part of NWO Japan with partners like Chono, Tenzan, NWO Sting and Michael Wall Street. Other Japan notes. Great Sasuke apparently re-injured his knee on his first day of all-out training on July 8th trying to set up a Phoenix Splash, Hayabusa's move, which is similar to a 450 except starting out as a moonsault and is probably the hottest of all the off-the-top rope moves in wrestling right now, although he's still starting back on July 18th. FMW's second pay-per-view show will be taped on August 22nd at the DirecTV studios in Tokyo as a studio show as opposed to an arena event. FMW has dropped women's wrestling altogether as they only had 2 women left, Crusher Maidamari and Shark Tsuchiya. Shinobu Kondori works the AJW show on July 26th at Korakuen Hall in a handicap match against both Kumiko Maekawa and Miho Wakizawa to build up for her defending the WWWA title, AJW's top belt, against Manami Toyota on August 23rd in Kawasaki. Hayabusa wrestles August 13th to August 16th for Michinoku Pro. Atsushi Onita returned to Japan on July 12th and had a press conference where he said he was going to start yet another new group to wrestle within FMW and talked about wanting to debut the explosive barbed wire match in the US in ECW in September. It is believed that Onita is going to be back full-time working every show for FMW shortly. He's mainly been working major shows since his retirement angle. Big Japan is currently doing a King of the Death Matches tournament to crown a World Death Match heavyweight champion with the finals on August 9th in Kawasaki. JWP announced several major matches over the upcoming weeks. July 31st in Kawasaki has Devil Masami and Cuddy Suzuki defending the JWP tag titles against Hikari Fukuoka and Tomoko Kuzumi. August 2nd at Korakuen Hall has Fukuoka defending the JWP title, although no opponent has been announced. August 7th in Sapporo has Fukuoka vs Masami in a non-title singles match, and Manami Toyota comes in as a special guest against Rieko Amano. August 17th in Osaka Furitsu Gym has Masami vs Dynamite Kansai for Jiazawa title. JWP will have its second annual Plum Mariko Memorial Show on August 13th in Tokyo at Ota Ward Gymnasium, which is in the area where Mariko Umeda grew up. After leaving Big Japan, Kendo Nagasaki, 49, will start with IWA Japan. Michinoku Pro will be doing a masked man tournament in which the eventual loser of the tournament has to unmask at the end using Great Sasuke, Super Delphin, Grand Naniwa, Tiger Mask, Sasuke the Great, Masked Tiger, Wild Shooter, NG Hammer, Flecha 2, Shiryu 2 and Palomino. The last 7 are basically no names. The fake Sasuke is Masao Orihara and fake Tiger is Takeshi Ono. Here and there, the July 11th through 17th issue of TV Guide had a listing of the 50 greatest sports moments on television, and wouldn't you know it, not one mention of pro wrestling on the list. However, in the list of the 10 strangest sports moments, they listed number 6 as the Antonio Inoki vs. Muhammad Ali match and number 7 at the Evel Knievel Snake River Canyon Jump. Vince McMahon Jr. was involved in the promotion of this as a closed-circuit event at the Memphis Power Pro tapings on July 11th. They continued to largely build around the Jerry Lawler vs. heel owner Randy Hales feud. Hales claimed that Lawler was the most egotistical person in the world and had brainwashed everyone in Memphis into thinking he was something that he wasn't. Hales said he'd fight Lawler live on TV if need be and challenged Lawler to come to the studio. It wound up with Lawler and Stacy showing up, but Hales locked them out of the studio and wouldn't let them in while it was pouring rain outside. Finally, Lawler decked a TV producer after getting in looking for Hales. Both Lawler and Stacy looked like hell with Stacy's hair all flat and her makeup running, and they claimed that as Lawler left his house to come to the studio, that Hales had the Giant King, Paulo Silva, staking him out and attacking him, but Lawler still wound up making it to the studio. Hales ended up running away and jumping into his car, but Stacy got in front of the car and Hales wouldn't run her over, and Lawler started hitting Hales' car with a baseball bat until security came out and calmed Lawler and Stacy down, and Hales sped away. Former jobber Trey Keller is now doing a German gimmick as Henrik Franz Keller to feud with Brian Christopher. The USWF show on July 25th in Odessa, Texas looks to be a good draw as they sold 500 tickets. The first day tickets were put on sale. The show will feature an 8-man heavyweight tournament, an 8-man middleweight tournament along with Paul Jones defending his light heavyweight title against David Davis, and an appearance by Frank Shamrock, who will be coaching some of his San Jose-based fighters on the show. Fabulous Moolah's LIWA will be holding its first East Coast convention from August 13th to August 16th at Lombardo South in Randolph, Massachusetts, which will feature a tour of Boston, a wrestling show, an awards ceremony, a dinner, and a brunch. Honorees for the banquet will be Killer Kowalski, Cora Livingstone, Abe Ford, Boston Promoter in the 60s, Jim Cornette, Brandy Alexander, Heidi Lee Morgan, Skylo Lowe, Donna Cristantello, Mad Dog Vachon, and others. For more info you can contact LIWA at P.O. Box 42081, Columbia, South Carolina 29206. Michael Kovac vs. Dirt Bike Kid headlines the IWW show on July 25th in Hanover, Germany, which also includes Ulf Herman, Robbie Brookside, and Tony St. Clair, among others. Music City Wrestling will be airing interview segments with Jim Cornette leading to the debut of Al Snow with the same head gimmick. Brickhouse Brown has been suspended for life from that office. With Brown gone, Eddie Combs is now managing Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins along with Andy Anderson. Top Feud continues to be Dunn and Riggins vs. Flash Flanagan and Wolfie D. Grand Wrestling Alliance is running July 25th in Ardmore, Pennsylvania at the Rec Center and August 1st in Philadelphia at the Sports Super Center. The latter show will include New Jack vs. Just Incredible. MMA. The lineup for the taped July 17th UFC Night of Champions will feature a first-run tape of the Frank Shamrock vs. Jeremy Horn middleweight title match as the main event, and the other matches scheduled, no doubt some of which will be heavily edited, are Hoist Gracie vs. Gerard Gordeau, UFC 1 Championship match, Gracie vs. Chemo, Gracie vs. Dan Severn, Gracie vs. Ken Shamrock, their second match which was a 36 minutes draw, Tank Abbott vs. Oleg Toktarov, Don Fry vs. Gary Goodridge, their first meeting, Mark Coleman vs. Fry, Abbott vs. Cal Warsham, Abbott vs. Steve Nelmark, Fry vs. Abbott, Vitor Belfort vs. Scott Ferrozzo, Coleman vs. Severn, Maurice Smith vs. Coleman, and Belfort vs. Randy Couture. Let's have a quiz. What matches on that list don't seem to make sense to appear on a show of the legendary matches? Marvin Hagler is out as announcer for K1 and will be replaced by Roy Jones Jr. K1 announced the bracketing for its North American Grand Prix tournament. Winner goes on to the World Grand Prix later in the year on August 7th in Las Vegas underneath the double main event of Maurice Smith vs. Peter Aerts and Andy Hug vs. Mike Labrie. The first round matches will pit Rick Rufus vs. Pedro Fernandez from Mexico, Jerome Turkin, a native of France who now lives in San Jose, versus Expedito da Silva, Brazil, Jean-Claude Lure vs. Tomasz Kukurezeski, Canada, and Curtis Schuster vs. Jean Riviere, Canada, who has previous experience in EFC. It will go on with semifinals and finals from the same bracketing as in the Rufus-Fernandez winner faces the Turkin da Silva winner, etc. Not only will the show air live on pay-per-view in the United States and Canada, but it will also air live on pay-per-view in Japan, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. It will be an interesting first for Japan because the show airs like on Sky Perfect TV starting at 10 a.m. the next morning, due to the time difference, but will air later that day, 4 p.m., on Fuji Network Television in edited form. It'll be interesting, although pay-per-view is in its infancy in Japan, how many people would pay for a TV show when most of the highlights will appear later that same day on free TV. K1, which is the master when it comes to television production even more than WWF, debuts a referee camera on the July 18th Nagoya Dome TV show. It's been done before in wrestling, and actually was considered something of a flop as the idea was dropped, but it's had more success in boxing. In the article on K1 2 weeks back when mentioning the rules are the same as Muay Thai, there is one notable difference, is that in K1, elbows are illegal. The belief is that since most Muay Thai fighters are very small, the potential for lethal damage from an elbow to the temple isn't great, while K1 fighters are almost all heavyweights. The other major difference between Muay Thai and K1 in practice is that Muay Thai primarily exists as a gambling sport almost like horse racing but with humans, whereas K1 isn't. K1 has also added 2 more house shows to its schedule, on August 28th and October 28th date both in Tokyo at the Yoyogi Gym, both of which will be headlined by Naoya Ogawa. It is being billed that first prize for winning the World Grand Prix in December at the Tokyo Dome is $500,000. Dan Henderson needed a second operation recently for the dislocated jaw he suffered in his match with Carlos Newton at the last UFC. The injury kept him out of the recent tryouts for the national team at Greco-Roman. Henderson is expected to be ready for the October 9th pay-per-view in a match with Frank Shamrock for the middleweight title, although it is not a definite that match will take place on the Brazil show. Tom Erickson, 6-0-1, is scheduled to face Igor Vovchanchyn, 22-1, on the undercard of the Nobuhiko Takada-Hickson Gracie Tokyo Dome match. Vovchanchyn has never faced what would be considered a top-caliber heavyweight in MMA, although he has destroyed large men like Nick Nutter and Paul Verlins. His lone loss was to Ring's pro wrestler Ilyakine Mikhail several years ago when he was just getting started. Mark Kerr, Oleg Toktarov and Marco Ruiz are also scheduled for that show. Vitor Belfort did an interview on Brazil television this past week where he stated he was getting back together with former trainer Carlson Gracie Jr. and challenged Ruiz to a match before the end of the year, also attempting to do some acting, and is up for a part playing a villain in the next Superman flick. The elusive Royce Gracie was interviewed by UFC for promotion of this week's pay-per-view and claimed that his back was 70% recovered from the pinched nerve that has kept him out of action this year. Gracie, when talking about the second match with Ken Shamrock, which went to a draw in 1995 in Charlotte, said that his father advised him against taking the match because it would have a time limit and he had experience fighting much larger men and felt it takes time to wear them out. Royce claimed that all Shamrock was doing in the match was trying to stall for a time limit draw. Of course, that doesn't explain why Shamrock has had an open challenge for the past 3 years to face Royce or Rickson Gracie without a time limit that they've declined, and it isn't like that's a match that no promoter would be interested in putting together. According to Shamrock's book, the last discussions they've had with the Gracie family is that Royce wanted Shamrock to get down to his weight of about 180 for a rematch, and Shamrock at the time said he couldn't get lighter than 200. A new group called World Extreme Combat Championships debuts on August 2nd in Brasilia, Brazil, with Carlos Barreto versus Dane Frazier in the main event. ECW. A couple of minor changes in the August 2nd Dayton pay-per-view lineup. A Masato Tanaka vs. Mike Awesome rematch has been added based on the quality of their match in Queens. Sabu and Rob Van Dam will defend the tag team title against Hayabusa and someone not as yet determined. Paul Heyman is attempting to bring in Jinsei Hakushi Shinzaki, since Hayabusa and Shinzaki are a regular tag team in Japan and had some great matches last year in the All Japan Tag Team Tournament. However, Shinzaki has a prior booking on August 2nd. The Jerry Lynn vs. Justin Credible match will be a straight singles match as opposed to a stipulation match, and Lance Storm vs. Chris Candido will also appear on the show. However, the plans of breaking up their tag team to set up the match have at least temporarily been dropped because Heyman sees Storm's personality starting to come through in his present role and doesn't want to change it. The advance at press time was 2,800 tickets sold for $94,000, so ECW will assuredly break its gate and attendance records at this show. The July 18th ECW Arena show looks to be Sabu and Van Dam vs. Storm and Candido, Credible and Awesome vs. Lynn and Tanaka, Tommy Dreamer vs. Bubba Ray Dudley, Sandman vs. Devon Dudley in a dueling Canes match, and Spike Dudley vs. Big Dick Dudley. While it is not finalized at press time, but should be before you read this, it is close to a definite that the November 1st pay-per-view, which will be the next one after August 2nd, will come from New Orleans. The plans for the explosive match appear to be that it will take place at an outdoor stadium, most likely in Atlantic City but possibly in Philadelphia, in mid-September. The house show this week were in the New England area, with a debut in Worcester, Massachusetts on July 11th drawing 1,350, July 12th in Manchester, Connecticut drew about 1,150, and July 13th in Revere, Massachusetts drew a sellout 1,200. The first night was the television taping, which was the only night Sandman worked due to the family situation. Tracy Smothers returned after being married and worked with Masato Tanaka every night in good matches, with Tanaka getting over well even in Revere, largely for his willingness to take brutal chair shots as opposed to being a good wrestler, which he is. A lot of Revere fans, when they had the Michinoku six-man tag there early last year and did a 4.5 stars match, catcalled the guys with Sushi and Hiroshima chants. New Jack did a high balcony dive for TV. Chris Candido nearly was injured seriously in Revere when an errant Sabu dive through a table turned into a knee drop to the ear, and Candido was bleeding like crazy, and it was said to be one of the scariest moments backstage ever in ACW, with Candido shaking and going into convulsions, being scared that he lost his ear. He ended up being fine but needing 10 stitches in his ear and will be wrestling this coming weekend. The Sabu and Rob Van Dam tag title matches with Lance Storm and Chris Candido were said to be devoid of psychology and largely a collection of missed moves, with Sabu in particular being so bad he was dangerous. Jerry Lynn and Justin Credible continued having good matches every night. Jason was also hospitalized with possible torn ligaments in his elbow when he elbow cracked the floor when catching Lynn as he did a running flip off the apron. When Yuki Kondo was at the ECW show in Queens, New York, he didn't want to do anything on television, and attending the show considered it something of a culture shock because the wrestling crowds in Pancrase are so quiet and polite, probably even too quiet, and ECW crowds were basically the opposite. From TV on that same Queens show, they aired Taz's win over Lance Storm, which was basically a 3 minutes Nitro-style match. Storm's high spots and aerial moves are great, and he sold well for Taz, but his punches and kicks were awful, and he does far too many of them for such a short match. Tanaka vs. Mike Awesome the Gladiator, went 8:04 and was probably the second best ECW TV match of the year in the 3.5 stars range. With Awesome's ring presence and high spot ability, he's tailor-made for ECW. Tanaka is a great opponent because Tanaka is great glue for a wrestler who isn't that good of a worker, and the fans were really into the near falls and into Awesome's big moves. There was one messed up power bomb spot where Awesome dropped Tanaka, but aside from that they worked together great with a lot of hot moves. Tanaka won with his discus elbow, but after the match Awesome power bombed him through a table. After that they had Spike Dudley beating Ulf Herman in 16 seconds, which was a way to try and get Spike over as a main eventer for the pay-per-view, but looked incredibly silly, and a bunch of trademark brawling with weapons and blood involving Dudley's streamer, Cronus, New Jack, and Spike. When Phil Lawfon recovers from his shoulder injury, they're going to do at least a match in Philadelphia with him against Doug Furnas. WCW. We don't have details at press time, but Chris Benoit suffered some sort of an injury, believed to have been a fractured elbow, and the sketchy reports were that he'd be out of action for a month or two. He was injured just before he was supposed to go on the Japan tour that he was said to really be looking forward to, since he had some big singles matches scheduled against the likes of Dr. Wagner Jr. and Shinjiro Otani. Ultimo Dragon will also be undergoing a few minor operations scheduled for July 21st in Atlanta, as he has a bad right knee, left knee and hand, and will be out of action at least 1 month. There were problems at the Georgia Dome when it came to the figures adding up, so as it turns out, the actual paid attendance was 35,514, which as a paid figure probably puts it in 6th place rather than 4th place on the all-time US list, as I presume Pat O'Connor versus Buddy Rogers in Chicago did more paid, and know that Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zbyszko at Shea Stadium in 1980 did 35,771 paid. This was by far the biggest week in the history of the promotion, as not only did they do the second best pay-per-view in company history, but over the 8-day period of July 6th to July 13th, they ran 6 house shows which totaled $2,008,407 or a $335,000 per event average, which is just a ridiculous figure, plus another $782,689 in merchandise, not to mention an estimated figure of more than $6.5 million from the pay-per-view shows, so you are talking about a $9 million week, which puts the Monday Night Ratings war into perspective about what it really means aside from it being the weekly measuring stick of everyone's ego. July 13th Nitro from Las Vegas at the MGM Grand Garden Arena drew a sellout of about 12,000, which was 10,731, paying $201,582. The show opened with Hogan blaming Scott Hall for losing to Goldberg and causing him to drop the title, and challenged Hall to a match with Eric Bischoff as referee. Bischoff acted as if he didn't want to ref. An hour later on Raw, in what appeared to be a spoof on this, Triple H asked McMahon to referee on their show. Disciple talked and did a promo on Page and challenged him to a match. Hall ended up walking out. Barbarian pinned Horace Boulder in 2:04 with a kick to the face. Match wasn't as bad as you'd think. After the match the Flock attacked Barbarian, and he was beating them all up for a while until finally the numbers got to him. Meng made the save and he and Barbarian cleaned house together, and then Meng put Barbarian in the Tongan death grip. This was mind-boggling to do the exact same angle with two guys that nobody cares about that you're going to do with Nash and Hall later in the same show. Kurt Hennig did an interview challenging Goldberg to a rematch and told Rick Rude he didn't need to come to ringside. J.J. Dillon, Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio Jr. and Dean Malenko came out for the conference, which led to Jericho getting the Cruiserweight title back and Mysterio Jr. and Malenko agreeing to wrestle later in the show for the #1 contendership. Throughout this entire deal they still never acknowledged Mysterio Jr.'s storyline injury from Jericho, treating it like Malenko was the only one who had a grudge against him. Jim Duggan pinned Rick Fuller with a knee drop in 1:48. Awful. I want to apologize for last week's joke regarding Scott Putski being arrested for impersonating a wrestler. I thought of the joke weeks back and was waiting for someone to use a power bomb to use it, and was just hoping just once that Duggan would use the power bomb. Anyway, Duggan really should be arrested. But if any prosecutor watched Nitro this week between Stevie Ray, Hogan, Hall, Disciple, and Mongo, they'd have to fill several cells with the convicts. Bagwell came out of the wheelchair. He doesn't need one, it was just for the angle to get Hogan over, as everything in this company ultimately is for, and called out Rick Steiner. Before he could say anything to Steiner, who had his arm in a sling, Hogan and Disciple showed up and Hogan began browbeating Bagwell and shoved him out of the wheelchair. This really sucked on so many levels. It was right at this moment when I realized WCW is going to lose Mondays consistently. If there was any message last week should have shown, it was that the face of WCW was no longer Hogan, and it was Goldberg. Instead, we get a pay-per-view show ruined by Hogan. Well, actually Rodman didn't help any. and a TV show designed as nothing but a personal vehicle once again for Hogan. Like when Bagwell can return, he's going to feud with Hogan. They could have allowed Raven or Jericho or even Hart or anyone else the heel heat of doing the angle with Bagwell that Bagwell could do a hot program with when he returns, but instead it's another of these WCW injury angles that never pays off. Hart beat Fit Finlay in 4:27 with a sharpshooter. Solid but unspectacular. Fans were chanting "We want Flair" during this one. Ray pinned the returning Rick Martel in 8:57 with the Tiger Driver 91. Flapjack, after Hart hit Martel with a chair. How the ref missed that one was really incredible. Fans hated this match, chanting not only boring but also chanting "Go to the finish." Think about the logic in booking Hart versus Finlay for 4:27 and Stevie Ray against anyone for 9 minutes. Ray did an interview claiming with his brother injured that he's now going to defend the TV title against anyone. Haven't we already been through that nonsense of guys defending titles they don't have enough this year? Conan beat Barry Darsow in 1:53 with the Tequila Sunrise. Page pinned Disciple in 2:25. As best I can tell, and I've sort of checked around about this, the feeling is that the incident backstage on July 6th where Disciple threw a fit because Page opened up the back of his head by stiffing him with a chair wasn't an angle for the boys and for the internet to set this up. In fact, there still is heat between these two, but they sort of acknowledged the incident in the interviews. Anyway, Rick Rude came out for the finish as Rude and Disciple collided and Page schoolboyed Disciple. Apparently Hogan nixed the Diamond Cutter as the finish, which is where Rude's involvement came in. I guess to show Page how to do chair shots that don't hurt, they gave Page 3 love taps with a chair. After watching those shots, there needs to be a happy medium. Raven won a triangle match over Kanyon and Saturn in 5:42 when Kanyon and Saturn were both counted out fighting each other. At one point Saturn did a high plancha putting Kanyon through a table. They also did a triple back suplex spot. Somewhere in here Raven suffered a broken rib and had to legitimately be taken to the hospital. He was at the show in Reno the next night but couldn't wrestle. Real good TV match. Mysterio Jr. pinned Malenko in 5:33 when Jericho hit Malenko with the title belt. Fantastic mat wrestling by both. Great flying by Ray. Just a super television match. Lex Luger and Scott Hall beat Alex Wright and Disco Inferno in 2:36 when Nash power-bombed Disco. Disco and Alex make an entertaining jobber tag team. Eddie Guerrero no contest Steve McMichael in 2:13 when Chavo ran in and the bell rang for no reason other than to show mercy on everyone watching. They should have rung the bell for that reason in the Stevie Ray and Duggan matches. Chavo acted like he wanted to join the Four Horsemen and came out with his hobby horse Pepe. McMichael tombstoned Chavo after the match. Hogan no contest Hall in 7 minutes of a match even worse than the pay-per-view match of the night before. Ungodly bad, and that's on a show that had a Duggan match. Bischoff did the heel ref gimmick where he favored Hogan throughout. Disciple attacked Hall. Hogan moves like he's underwater. Page did a run-in and gave Bischoff the Diamond Cutter. Hogan and Disciple beat up Hall and Page. Nash ran in to help Hall and they signaled like they were back together again. But when Nash tried to powerbomb Hogan, Hall attacked him. I don't think it's because they already saw the angle with Barbarian and Meng that there was no reaction to Hall turning on Nash again. It's because nobody believes it and nobody wants to see it. Hogan leg dropped Page and Hogan and Hall hugged when it was over. Show ended with Goldberg pinning Hennig in 1:22 with the jackhammer. Only time will tell, but with the show built around Hogan instead of Goldberg, I'm getting the sense it is continues the long-term prognosis of Goldberg is closer to Nikita Koloff than Steve Austin. Rumor has it that Goldberg was given a raise just before getting the title up to 4 years for $4 million, which must be some sort of a record for someone with 10 months in. The first Goldberg vs. Giant title match will take place as the dark match. Well, at least at this point it's still supposed to be a dark match. Main event for July 27th at the Alamodome in San Antonio. Eric Watts is expected to start working here. July 8th in Birmingham, Alabama for Thunder drew 12,945, 12,248 paying $226,450. The show did a 3.31 rating and 6.1 share on the live show and a 1.4 rating and a 5.1 share on the replay. The number has to be considered good because the last time the show was moved to a Wednesday it did a 2.7. Public Enemy beat Tokyo Magnum and Shimo Nobunaga in 2:53 when Grunge pinned Nobunaga after Rocco put him through 2 tables with a senton. Aside from the table break, it was horrible. Wright and Disco attacked PE after the match. Ernest Miller beat Villano 4. Actually Villano 5 ran in for the switch but Miller used his feliner on him and got the pin in 3:38. Juventud Guerrera pinned Judo Suwa in 3:38 after 2 Juvi drivers. A hell of a short match. The flock all attacked Guerrera and Kidman gave him the shooting star press after the match. Steve McMichael did an interview and they aired a clip of an Arn Anderson interview regarding a match with Ric Flair. They pointed out that Anderson beat Flair in that match, apparently trying to get over the idea that Anderson was really the star of the Horsemen and not Flair, so it's okay to reform the Horsemen without Flair. Hey, in the all-time list of bad ideas, this still beats the hell out of the Bischoff talk show segment. Conan beat Stevie Ray in 205 via DQ for a chair shot. Ray tried to hit him a second time but Booker T grabbed the chair from him. Raven and Boulder beat Canyon and Saturn in 5:13 of a better-than-average match when Lodi threw power in Saturn's eyes and Raven got off the tape and Canyon was put on it, so Saturn dropped an elbow off the top rope onto the table and Canyon and the table didn't break, allowing Raven to pin Canyon. McMichael pinned Fuller with a tombstone piledriver in 227. Jericho beat Ultimo Dragon in 6:02 with a Lion Tamer to keep the Cruiserweight title in a great television match. Main event was supposed to be Hennig versus Page, but as Hennig went to the ring, Vincent ran in with a note from his mother, well, they said his lawyer, saying that Kurt had to be excused from PE because he had a bad knee or something. Hennig and Vincent then attacked Page until Goldberg's music started playing, and they went off the air before Goldberg came out. Goldberg beat Hall in a dark match. Hall was given the option of doing the 2 minutes job or the 8 minutes job and decided on the 8 minutes job, and they had a good match. WCW Saturday Night Tapings on July 7th in Macon, Georgia drew 3,572, paying $78,465. Basically nothing to the show. Biggest profile TV match was Hall over Conan. Goldberg beat Hall in the dark match after the show. Fans in Macon were really upset because they advertised Goldberg, Page, Giant, and Luger, and the only one of the four who was there was Goldberg. The week before in Columbus, Georgia, there was a similar situation. In both markets there were a lot of complaints issued at the radio stations that promoted the shows because WCW advertised talent that wasn't there. Rick Martel's nephew, who wrestles under the name Kevin Martel, is headed to EMLL ESPN Sports Center all day on July 12th, ran a feature prepared, which actually never ran due to the baseball strike which took place in 1995 on great mainstream sports stars of the past who did pro wrestling. Davey Boy Smith is now out of action with bone chips in his bad knee. From the most recent TV taping, WCW signed Vampiro Canadiense but didn't sign Atlantis or Emilio Charles Jr. Nothing against Vampiro, but it shows WCW's lack of an eye for talent because Charles is by far the most talented of the three. Then again, they've got Silver King under contract, and he blows away his brother, Dr. Wagner Jr., and look what New Japan has done with Wagner as compared with what WCW has done with the better brother. Ron Race is out of the flock. There is talk of repackaging him. As you can see, they are cleaning up Kidman, trying to slowly move him toward being a serious wrestler. Giant's injury suffered going over the top rope and landing with his elbow on the apron from the Kevin Green clothesline on July 6th turned out to be a bad bruise and not a fracture. ABC World News Tonight is expected to do a feature on pro wrestling sometime this week. They were in San Diego for the pay-per-view. Conan has signed a contract extension for a few years, so don't look for any of the main Mexican wrestlers, Juvi, Psicosis, or Mysterio Jr., to be leaving. Guys like La Parca and Silver King are another story as they aren't necessarily as closely aligned. That's actually a blow for WWF because they've got a Latino TV show that debuts in the fall and their biggest star at this point under contract is Papi Chulo, and that isn't going to fly. The July 10th show at the Forum in Los Angeles drew 15,821 fans, 14,678 paying $280,738, which I believe is the largest crowd ever for wrestling at the Forum. Wrestling never drew well there, and it is for certain the largest gate for pro wrestling in Southern California with the exception of the 3 WrestleManias. Most accounts were that it turned out to be a really good house show. Booker T pinned Finlay to keep the TV title in 10:01 with the missile dropkick. Eddie pinned Chavo with the frog splash in 17:14 in a match that was considerably better than their pay-per-view match. Guerrera and Psicosis and Ciclo beat Damien and Villanos in 11:06 in a match said to be sloppy as hell. The only one of the 6 who was over was Guerrera. Dragon beat Malenko via countout in 10:29 in a match with very good wrestling and no heat ending when Jericho came to ringside and Malenko chased him away. Jericho kept the Cruiserweight title beating Mysterio Jr. via DQ in 10:57 when he got the Lion Tamer on, but Malenko interfered for the DQ. The crowd reaction to Mysterio Jr. was really disappointing. Conan beat Vincent in 3:32. Conan got a huge reaction coming out but there was no heat at all for the match. Nash and Luger beat Hart and Giant via DQ in 8:41 when Hogan interfered with Vincent and Connon made the save. Hart was said to be really good, and the other three phoned it in. Goldberg pinned Hennig in 6:57 to keep the title, and Sting beat Hogan with a Scorpion Deathlock submission in a cage match in 11:06, which was said to have been terrible. Even though it was a cage match, half the match was outside the ring and Hogan bladed. Radio sportscaster Jim Rome really had a field day with wrestling the day after the Rodman match. He ripped on the match, well, anyone is welcome to that one. Then he claimed that wrestlers never get hurt, that all they do is get a tan, get greased up, and take steroids. When callers said that Rodman and Malone were taking the spots of people who have worked hard in wrestling, he said that nobody works hard in wrestling and that it's all fake. Great Muta and Masahiro Chono will be working on the July 20th Nitro from Salt Lake City. Doug Furness was backstage in San Diego talking about wanting to take a few months off. Also backstage looking for work at the show were the Power Twins. Tom Howard, who worked a few years ago in AAA as KGB, is scheduled for a tryout at the Thunder in Oakland. There will be a Nitro-themed restaurant opening in Las Vegas at the Excalibur Hotel. All of the luchadores under contract except Ultimo Dragon have now been officially banned from working any shows in Mexico unless they're booked by Sonny Wanu to work for Paco Alonso at Arena Mexico. Whether Alonso will do a WCW versus EMLL feud or just do the standard old-time booking of the guys as Rudos and Technicos isn't clear. Dragon's deal is different because he never signed away his worldwide booking rights and WCW only owns his rights for the United States. Ultimo Dragon's students from Mexico called Little Dragon and Tokyo Magnum on Nitro actually go by the ring name of Dragon Kid and Magnum Tokyo, but names got screwed up in miscommunication. At last report, Ric Flair was still in the lead in the online voting for Time magazine's Man of the Century. Flair had about 50,000 votes as compared to 38,000 for Adolf Hitler, and nobody else was close. Jesus Christ was in 4th place and Raven was in 5th place, and I guess all 4 of which are ridiculous for 4 very different reasons. The only regular house show of the week was July 14th in Reno, North Carolina, which drew 6,782, paying $142,440. The show was headlined by Giant beating Nash via DQ when Nash hit Giant with a chair, and the first ever singles meeting of Hart and Page with Page going over clean with a diamond cutter. Merchandise for the week previously that we didn't have for last week's issue was $356,325 or $8.30 per head. For this past week, not including the pay-per-view show, it was $386,704 or $9.38 per head. WCW Saturday Night on July 4th did a 1.7 rating, and on July 11th it did a 2.2 rating. WWF. Steve Austin had a photo shoot this past week for the cover of TV Guide, which, considering the visibility of that weekly, is huge. I can't recall a wrestler ever getting a cover, although Hogan may have gotten a small insert photo on the cover in 1990 when they were doing the biggest TV stars of the decade of the 80s, and Hogan finished unusually high on the list. The day Austin's photo hits the stands is the official sign to the mainstream that Hogan is done, because a wrestler made a major magazine cover that virtually everyone that goes shopping for food at any time, whether they buy it or not, will see the TV Guide cover, and it wasn't Hogan, so therefore Hogan becomes officially yesterday's news. Raw taping on July 13th in East Rutherford, New Jersey drew a sellout of 17,569, which was 15,620, paying $323,987. The show opened with 2 tryout matches as Steve Corino beat Julio Sanchez and Ace Darling beat Devon Storm. For Shotgun, 2 Cold Scorpio and Farouk beat Savio Vega and Jesus Castillo when Scorpio pinned Castillo, Edge beat Pierre, Val Venis beat Papichulo, and Dustin Runnels beat Jeff Jarrett via DQ. Raw opened with the introduction of Shawn Michaels as the new color commentator. Michaels was a total babyface both in shaking hands, demeanor, and everything else. I can understand the idea of wanting him there because he's a big star. He's making $15,000 a week staying home when we can't wrestle. At the same time, it came off as a desperation move based on losing the ratings for 1 week, because his big return should be a shock to either join with DX or be against them, and now he's around and they're around, and it's like WCW where the angle isn't acknowledged anymore, to the point that when he comes back, there's no angle, or if they try and do it months down the road, it won't mean half as much if they've all been around and nobody talked about it, and his return to the arenas and pay-per-view won't be as big a deal when he's been on TV every week for months. Even forgetting all that, more importantly, there is a very serious part of all this. As great a performer in the ring as he is, and he's probably the most talented guy over all of our generation, He's suffered a lot of concussions, and while he can get away with being flighty on interviews because it's in his character, it becomes too frequent and scary a reminder of reality to see him for 2 hours talking because he's too far out there. Ric Flair would suck as a color commentator also, but as great as Ross has been this year, this was the first week where WWF announcing was way below the standard of WCW, and the reason was Michaels. Anyway, Undertaker pinned Vader with a tombstone in 4:36 of a bad match. Mankind ran in to hit Undertaker with a chair, but Kane took the chair away from him and hit Vader with it. Bart Gunn beat Bob Holly in the Brawl for All. Realistically, it had to be worked because to make the angle work, Holly had to lose, but he also had to not get hurt, which meant Gunn had to be careful with him. Then Jason Sensation, Jason Travers, the Impressionist, came out to ringside doing his Owen and Bret Hart imitations. This whole angle was fantastic. He did Owen while Owen was backstage seething. Actually, it was the best work Owen has done as well. They set up a spot where he did Bret so Michaels could get in his dig as Bret for being a mid-carder. Finally, Owen came out and attacked Jason, and slapped around Lawler, who tried to protect him, and again it made Michaels look like an idiot just standing there and doing nothing. Hart put the sharpshooter on him. The funny thing was watching Jason tapping out, like in a bar brawl you tap. Finally, the Nation tried to pull Hart off, but he was persistent until DX showed up making the save. This led to X-Pac and Triple H beating Hart and Rocky Maivia in 6:30 when X-Pac pinned Maivia after dropping him on his head. Very aggressive, good match. Maivia kicked out of a pin after being hit with the European title, but X-Pac ended up pinning Maivia anyway, which is pretty clever booking, letting the small guy beat the huge guy. Steve Blackman beat Mark Marrow in 2:13 with a front kick. Jackie distracted Blackman and Marrow low-blowed him and gave him the TKO. Jackie went to the top rope, but Sable shoved her off and she crotched herself. It was a hell of a spot by Jackie. Kane and Mankind beat New Age Outlaws to win the tag titles in 5:35. Triple H and X-Pac were again brawling with the Nation in the eye when D'Lo Brown came out and frog splashed Road Dogg with his chest protector, allowing Kane to pin him after a tombstone. Match itself was pretty bad with little heat, although after seeing Hogan vs. Hall, it was a classic. They showed a backstage bit with Triple H yelling at McMahon wanting a rematch, while at the same time putting over McMahon's physique to him, saying he should be the ref and how big his arms are and how buffed he is. Can't they live the ass-kissing of the boss to backstage? Can you imagine how bad it would be on TV if Nash showed up and asked Bischoff to be ref, because everyone knows he's got the fastest feet in all of wrestling, and in real life he's tougher than the wrestlers. You'd think these cool younger gimmicks would preclude kissing ass to older people about their physiques and or vanity. Kaientai beat Takamichi Inoku and Brian Christopher and Scott Taylor in 3:39 when Dick Togo pinned Taylor with a senton bomb. If Christopher and Taylor would have been the new Midnight Express, it still probably would have failed because WWF doesn't let small guys get over except for X-Pac because he's in with the right crowd. But at least it would have been more entertaining the entire way, flaming down. Good wrestling, but everyone knows in WWF not to care about these guys. Christopher attacked Taka after the match. Of course, Venice came out and did a promo showing Mrs. Yamaguchi-san under the sheets with him. Obviously this was going to happen, but it seemed about 6 weeks premature on the angle. Besides, the model playing Mrs. San is 17, so isn't that statutory rape in New Jersey? Maybe that's next week's version of the angle that the joke is on Val, because we all know one of the greatest ways to get a babyface over nowadays is by taking him to jail. Anyway, it's kind of funny where they do the modernized version of Jake and Cheryl Roberts with Rick Rude, but nowadays Rick Rude not only gets to sleep with Cheryl by the 3rd week of the angle but is the clear-cut babyface for doing so. Then again, in WWF world, Japanese can only be little naive childlike comedy figures. McMahon called out Undertaker and asked if he was in cahoots with Kane. Undertaker told him to go to hell. Austin showed up and asked Undertaker the same thing, and Undertaker told him he wanted to buy the latest cool t-shirt. Actually, he told him to go to hell. It must have been someone else at the time wanting to buy the new Austin t-shirt. DX showed up and Triple H told McMahon he had a way to find out and wanted a tag title rematch with Austin and Undertaker both as referees, and McMahon agreed to it. Next up was Severn vs. Godfather. Finally the rematch came. Mankind took a hard shot with the ring steps, but it was another weak match. Crowd was dead and there were actually boring chants, very reminiscent of the Savage Page cage match when WCW worked Nassau. Amazing with all the star power out there, but it was amazing at WCW as well. Of course Mike C. Iota got bumped. When Road Dogg had Kane pinned, Austin counted 2 and Undertaker pulled him out of the ring. Kane then choke-slammed Road Dogg and Undertaker counted 2, but Austin stopped him. Kane ended up attacking Austin and Undertaker attacked Mankind. Everyone started fighting everyone, with Undertaker and Austin getting to choke slam and stunner anyone they felt like as the show went off the air. They had been advertising a dark 10-man tag match for weeks involving all the top names, but it never took place. July 14th tapings from Binghamton, New York saw Drozdov over Tiger Ali Singh. Michinoku beat Papichulo to keep the light heavyweight title. Midnights won a squash. Henry beat Vader in a tug-of-war, but after the match Vader destroyed Henry and left him laying. Bradshaw and Funk beat Taylor and Christopher. Mustafa pinned Runnels, and Bangers beat Kurgan and Golga with a collection of weirdos at ringside, including a woman with enormous breasts wearing a shirt that said "Jackal me off," and when she took 2 shirts off. As it turned out, she had majorly stuffed her bra. Scorpio beat 8-Ball and Williams beat Pierre in the brawls. McMahon opened Raw and ordered Undertaker to face both Kane and Mankind in a handicap match and told Undertaker to go to hell. Undertaker then choke-slammed McMahon, Pat Patterson, and Gerald Briscoe. Brown beat Helmsley to win the European title when Maivia gave Triple H the urinage. Yamaguchi-san came out with Kaientai and Mrs. San and said she had done wrong and was going to have to be punished, and pulled out a paddle, but before he could hit her, her knight in shining armor showed up for the save. Chains vs. Animal thankfully never got started, as Skull and 8-Ball attacked Animal and held him down, and Ellering was about to run him over with a motorcycle until Hawk made the save. Blackman beat Jarrett. Severn and Shamrock were in Blackman's corner, so they are back to the Shooters group concept. Hart attacked Shamrock and was pounding on him until Blackman made the save. Severn just watched Hart pound on Shamrock and didn't care and walked off. Undertaker then left the arena, refusing to do the match. McMahon then called out Austin and ordered him to replace Undertaker in the handicap match, and that if he didn't, he'd be stripped of the title. Austin threw the belt down and McMahon and told him he was quitting the promotion. McMahon called him a coward, at which point Austin agreed to do the match. Hart beat Farouk with the sharpshooter. Mero and Jackie began insulting Sable, who came out. They attacked Sable and ripped her dress off and left her in her underwear. Edge made the save and gave Mero the same move that Canyon has been calling the new flatliner, and then Edge ran off. Michaels came out at this point, so he only did color for a few matches, and he hugged DX, so that question has already been answered. For now they are all babyfaces. Maivia kept the IC title, beating X-Pac via DQ when Triple H interfered, hitting Maivia with a chair in what was said to have been a great match. This may be off TV and is almost surely a plant, since it's happening so frequently at certain house shows on the same tour but never at shows on another tour. But anyway, a woman took off her top after the match. Austin vs. Kane and Mankind ended without a decision, as Undertaker showed up and accidentally hit Kane with a chair. After the show went off the air, Undertaker gave Kane a tombstone. Titan will be adding a second primetime show for a test run in August from 7 to 8 p.m. every Sunday night. No word on the makeup of the show. In the latest on the lawsuits back and forth, Titan Sports is appealing the first judge's ruling that Mark Madden actually is a journalist and thus is allowed under the Pennsylvania Shield law to protect his sources. The episode of Pacific Blue with Hunter Hearst Helmsley airs on August 9th. Ted Annis, who is the nephew of Bret and Owen Hart and grandson of Stu, daughter of Georgia Hart Annis and BJ Annis, will be attending the next WWF training camp from July 18th to July 25th. I believe he's around 17 years old and has been training to get into pro wrestling for several years and works indies in Alberta. Terry Funk will be appearing in an upcoming John Carpenter movie. SummerSlam on August 30th in Madison Square Garden is officially sold out. So is the December 6th England-only pay-per-view from London. A couple of minor corrections. 2 weeks back, when talking about Mick Foley's bump and making note of Jimmy Snuka's famous dives off the cage in Madison Square Garden, we listed the Snuka-Morocco match as being in 1984 when it was actually in late 1983. We also, in mentioning the song Highway to Hell as the theme for SummerSlam, listed it as an early 80s song, which is technically incorrect as it was released on December 13, 1979. Weekend house show saw July 10th in Boston, drawing 10,629, paying $236,131, which is the largest WWF regular house show gate ever in Boston. July 11th in Atlantic City drew 6,261, paying $161,264, and July 12th in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania drew a sellout 6,006, paying $108,626, which is the all-time record gate for that city. Merchandise for the week was $317,257 or $8.24 per head. Both Austin and Mankind worked the entire weekend. In Boston, Undertaker and Austin beat Mankind and Kane on top in 8:27, which is about half the length of a usual WWF main event. Austin and Undertaker fought each other for about 30 seconds after the match before they were pulled apart. Some changes for the July 26th pay-per-view show. Apparently the Nation vs DX 8-man tag has been pulled and instead will be 2 singles matches, a 2 out of 3 falls IC title with Maivia vs Triple H and a European title match with Brown vs X-Pac. Speaking of X-Pac, he did an interview in Pro Wrestling Torch which among other things officially exposed the WCW drug policy. In the entire time he was in the company, which is close to 18 months, he was never drug tested. That's amazing because even though he's got the rep for having cleaned himself up, it is no secret and he himself never tries to hide the fact he had some major problems not that many years ago, which was actually the reason WWF released him in the first place to let him join WCW when he had a valid WWF contract. Crackhead Bob, Hank the Angry Drunken Dwarf and Fred the Elephant Boy from the Howard Stern Show were all backstage but weren't used on camera. Fred the Elephant Boy is actually well known as a longtime pro wrestling fan. Weekend ratings for the July 4th to 5 weekend saw Livewire at 1.9 and Superstars at 1.7, and for July 11th to 12 it was Livewire at 1.7 and Superstars at 2.1. The Readers' Pages. Brawl for All. I was pleased to see the Brawl for All matches as shoots. This could revolutionize pro wrestling and provide employment for other shoot fighters should John McCain succeed in his persecution attempt of UFC. The Brawl for All concept was simple, incorporating one basic move from 2 sports, punching from boxing and takedowns from wrestling. The short duration minimizes the risk of serious injury. I hope that, despite the initial unfavorable reaction from fans, the WWF will stick with the concept long enough to develop the continuity that will win over additional fans. This is a natural venue for competitors like Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, and Steve Blackman. Carl Lurbs. Anchorage, Alaska. Response from Dave Meltzer: at this point the WWF isn't doing this to provide employment for shoot fighters as much as simply try something new in an attempt to get intrigue into some wrestlers and matchups, which at this point would ordinarily mean nothing for ratings. Observer. It's bad enough that you use the Observer to poke fun at wrestlers' hairstyles and religious beliefs and at Tony Schiavone's weight, but when you turn your venom on poor Sable, I must finally say enough. Your relentless comments about her breasts are childish and cruel. She's an adult, and if she chooses to increase her bust to cup sizes that haven't been invented yet, who are you to judge? That is a personal decision between Sable, her boss, and her plastic surgeon. While you're at it, please stop making fun of Jerry Lawler's physique, Lou Albano's intellect, Scott Steiner's biceps, Gene Okerlund's integrity, Pat Patterson's lifestyle, Ed Leslie's suntan, the Nitro Girls' coordination, the hair on Dutch Mantle's back, Kayantai's height, Paul Bearer's chins, Mark Madden's photo in the WCW magazine, and Steve McMichael in general. Scott Cornish. New Hartford, New York. Goldberg. All the praise toward Bill Goldberg is totally moronic. Goldberg may receive his paycheck from WCW, but he should stand up and thank Steve Austin and Vince McMahon for his popularity. Sleazy E said there was no way to market someone in black trunks without a gimmick. Seems to me that is Goldberg. If there had not been a Steve Austin, there would be not a Bill Goldberg. One last thing to Bischoff. I bet you are back to loving Tuesdays now when the ratings come in. Looks like you got exactly what you wished for. Kimberly Neese. Austin, Indiana. Response from Dave Meltzer: Goldberg most certainly has a gimmick. In fact, everything about his ring persona is a gimmick. Everyone sells big for him. He doesn't sell for anyone. And everyone goes down in 2 minutes. Aside from the black trunks and shaved head, there is no similarity at all to Austin, who also is a gimmick in that he kicks everyone's ass and nobody kicks his unless it's an angle to set up him kicking theirs. If anything, Goldberg is the one example where Bischoff totally one-upped McMahon, because McMahon had Shamrock, who was the real deal, and Bischoff took someone with the same basic persona and gimmick McMahon should have given Shamrock. And even though Shamrock has been a success because he turned out to be a far greater worker than anyone could have logically hoped for, WWF did drop the ball on using him to their best advantage, and Bischoff most definitely didn't drop the ball at all on Goldberg. ECW is getting extremely pathetic nowadays. Their world champion is out and not defending the title. All the main events have the Dudleys and Jack Victory involved. After all the bumps Beulah has taken, I didn't see anything special about her taking 3D, although they did a great job on television getting it over. Jaiwant Bala. Burke, Virginia. McMahon. I don't think you give Vince McMahon the credit he deserves. What he's done is amazing considering the lack of talent that he has to work with. I would love to see what kind of ratings he would be pulling in if he had the lineup that WCW has. John Davis. Hyde Park, New York. K1. Being a K1 fan, I was happy to see someone finally write about the inner workings of K1. None of the major no-holds-barred or kickboxing magazines have ever done a major article discussing K1. Having said that, I'd like to pass on a little more info. Andy Hug is K1's top star, but I think it has more to do with his look than his actual ability as a kickboxer. He and Mike Bernardo both have a look that says "don't mess with me," which translates well on television. This is why both are on numerous TV commercials in Japan and why they get pushed in K1. Peter Aerts has been K1's most dominating force since Kazuyoshi Ishii started the company, but he doesn't have the look of Bernardo or Hug. That's why he doesn't get pushed as hard. Granted, he is probably their best fighter, but he is not as exciting as seeing Bernardo or Hug. You were right in saying that Ernesto Hoost is K1's best technical fighter. The man puts combos together better than anyone I've ever seen in kickboxing. Along with Mr. Perfect, Hoost is also called Mr. Complete Fighter, because he doesn't rely on any one skill to win his fights, like Power Puncher Bernardo or Flashy Kicks Hug. I'm amazed that Pride can still be in existence after the poorhouses for their last 2 shows. From the photos of the Nobuhiko Takada vs. Kyle Sturgeon match, you could tell it was a work. Kazushi Sakuraba's domination of Carlos Newton is not that surprising when you consider that Sakuraba came in with at least a 30-pound weight advantage. Both men have similar skill, but most insiders felt it would come down to Sakuraba's weight advantage. Also, Sakuraba won with a knee bar, not an arm bar. It is said the way rings has taken a nosedive in attendance. Just 2 months ago they sold out 7,600 in Osaka. Of course, that was the show with the now infamous Valentine Overeem vs. Kiyoshi Tamura match. Actually, if you think about it, that was the Rings equivalent of the Shawn Michaels vs. Bret Hart match in that it changed the course of Rings forever. Jonathan D'Antoni. Belrose, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: don't believe fictitious weights. Sakuraba's weight edge over Newton was closer to 5 or 10 pounds. Newton was 177 at the last UFC and looked the same here. I bumped into Sakuraba that same night at a Subway sandwich shop and he was much smaller than you'd think, I'd guess 180 to 185, and he didn't look any different in the match. Both men are tremendous technical fighters for their weight.